The dust had barely settled on the battlefield of Plataea when Sparta found itself thrust into a position of unprecedented authority across the Greek world. The victory over Xerxes' massive Persian invasion force in 479 BC marked not merely the end of an existential threat, but the beginning of Sparta's golden age of hegemonic power. The bronze-clad hoplites who had stood firm against impossible odds now returned home as the acknowledged saviours of Hellas, their scarlet cloaks and lambda-emblazoned shields symbols of Greek resistance that commanded respect from Corinth to Aegina. The immediate aftermath of the Persian Wars revealed the extent to which Sparta had emerged as the dominant force in Greek politics. While Athens pursued its naval ambitions in the Aegean through the Delian League, Sparta consolidated its grip on the Peloponnese with methodical precision. The Peloponnesian League, which had existed in various forms since the mid-6th century, transformed under Spartan leadership from a loose confederation of allied city-states into a sophisticated hegemonic system that would dominate southern Greece for the next half-century. The structure of this league reflected Spartan pragmatism rather than imperial ambition. Unlike the Athenian model, which increasingly resembled outright empire with tribute payments and democratic impositions, Sparta maintained the fiction of allied equality, while exercising decisive control through military superiority and diplomatic pressure. Each member state retained its internal autonomy, continuing to govern according to local customs and constitutions, yet major foreign policy decisions required Spartan approval. This arrangement proved particularly effective because it aligned with traditional Greek concepts of interstate relations, while providing Sparta with the military resources necessary to maintain regional dominance. The League's military organisation centred on Sparta's ability to mobilise substantial hoplite forces at short notice. Member states contributed troops rather than tribute, creating a system where Spartan kings could field armies of unprecedented size for Greek standards. During major campaigns, these forces could exceed 30,000 heavy infantry, supported by light troops and cavalry from allied contingents. The sight of such an army advancing across the Peloponnesian landscape, with Spartan units forming the disciplined core surrounded by allied phalanxes, bearing the distinctive shields and armour of their home cities, represented a level of military coordination that few contemporary powers could match. Sparta's hegemonic control extended beyond mere military dominance to encompass sophisticated diplomatic mechanisms. The League Assembly, meeting in Sparta, provided a forum where allied representatives could voice concerns and participate in decision-making processes, yet the Spartan delegation invariably held decisive influence. This system proved remarkably durable because it offered smaller states protection from external threats, while preserving their dignity through formal consultation procedures. Cities like Tegea, which had previously resisted Spartan expansion, now found themselves secure within a framework that guaranteed their survival against both internal revolution and external conquest. The effectiveness of this hegemonic system rested fundamentally on the internal stability and military excellence that characterized Sparta during this period. The dual kingship, which had evolved over centuries into a sophisticated balance of powers, reached its peak efficiency in managing both domestic affairs and foreign campaigns. The two royal houses, the Aegeads and Eurypontids, provided a natural system of checks and balances that prevented the concentration of power while ensuring effective leadership during crises. When one king led armies in the field, the other remained in Sparta to oversee domestic administration and maintain communication with allied states. The Gerousia, or Council of Elders, functioned as the supreme deliberative body that guided Spartan policy with remarkable consistency. Composed of 28 men over 60 years of age, elected for life, plus the two kings, this institution combined the wisdom of experience with the authority of hereditary leadership. The Gerontes, having proven themselves through decades of military service and civic participation, possessed the knowledge and judgment necessary to navigate complex diplomatic situations, while maintaining Sparta's traditional values. Their deliberations, conducted in the ancient council chamber near the Agora, shaped decisions that affected the entire Greek world, yet they remained grounded in the practical concerns of Spartan society. The Ephorit provided the crucial third element in this governmental trinity, serving as both executive authority and constitutional guardian. The 5 ephors, elected annually by the citizen assembly, wielded extraordinary powers that included the ability to depose kings, conduct foreign negotiations, and oversee the complex legal system that governed Spartan society. Their authority derived not from birth or wealth, but from popular mandate, creating a democratic element within an otherwise aristocratic system. The ephors' daily presence in the marketplace, their accessibility to ordinary citizens, and their responsibility for maintaining public order ensured that governmental power remained responsive to citizen concerns while preserving institutional stability. This governmental structure proved particularly effective because it distributed authority among multiple institutions while maintaining clear lines of responsibility. During military campaigns, the king in the field possessed absolute authority over strategic and tactical decisions, yet he remained accountable to the ephors for his conduct and to the Gerousia for major policy choices. This system prevented the emergence of military dictatorships while ensuring decisive leadership during critical moments. The famous discipline of Spartan armies reflected not merely individual training, but institutional arrangements that supported effective command structures and maintained morale through predictable, legitimate authority. The economic foundation that supported this political and military superstructure rested on the helot system, a form of state-controlled serfdom that provided the material basis for Spartan military excellence. The helots, primarily descended from the conquered populations of Laconia and Messenia, worked the agricultural estates that fed the Spartan citizen body, while their labour freed the Spartiates for full-time military training and civic participation. This arrangement, brutal by modern standards, created unprecedented military efficiency by eliminating the economic concerns that typically limited citizen-soldier availability in other Greek states. The helot population, numbering perhaps 200,000 individuals compared to fewer than 10,000 full Spartan citizens, cultivated the fertile valleys of the Eurotas and Pamissos rivers using agricultural techniques that produced substantial surpluses. Each Spartan citizen received an allotment of land worked by helot families, providing sufficient food and basic necessities to maintain a comfortable lifestyle without personal labour. The helots delivered fixed portions of their harvest to their Spartan masters, typically half the total production, while retaining enough for their own subsistence and the maintenance of their families. This system created a complex social dynamic that required constant vigilance and occasional violence to maintain. The annual declaration of war against the helots, proclaimed by the ephors each autumn, legalized the killing of potentially rebellious individuals while serving as a psychological weapon to maintain submission. Young Spartans participated in the Cryptia, a secretive institution that combined military training with domestic surveillance, spending months in the countryside monitoring helot activities and eliminating perceived threats. These practices, while morally reprehensible, proved effective in preventing large-scale uprisings during Sparta's peak period and maintaining the economic stability necessary for military dominance. The military superiority that emerged from this social system centered on the agoge, the comprehensive education and training program that transformed Spartan boys into the most feared heavy infantry in the Greek world. Beginning at age 7, when boys left their families to enter communal barracks, the agoge subjected future warriors to 20 years of increasingly demanding physical and psychological conditioning. The training emphasized not individual heroics, but collective discipline and mutual dependence that created phalanx formations capable of maintaining cohesion under the most extreme battlefield conditions. The daily routine of agoge participants combined physical conditioning with weapons training, tactical instruction, and character development designed to produce warriors who valued honor above life and unit cohesion above personal survival. Boys learned to endure hunger, cold, and pain without complaint, developing the mental toughness necessary for prolonged campaigns in hostile territory. They practiced with the hoplon shield, dory spear and xiphus sword until weapon handling became instinctive, while formation drills instilled the precise coordination required for effective phalanx combat. The culmination of agoge training produced hoplites whose battlefield performance consistently exceeded that of their opponents. Spartan phalanxes advanced with mechanical precision, maintaining perfect alignment despite rough terrain and enemy pressure, their bronze-faced shields overlapping to create an impenetrable wall of metal and wood. The sight of these formations approaching, with scarlet cloaks flowing behind bronze-armoured figures and spear points glinting in perfect rows, typically induced panic in opposing armies before actual combat began. The psychological impact of Spartan military reputation often proved as decisive as their tactical skill, causing enemies to break ranks or abandon positions rather than face the legendary ferocity of Lacedaemonian warriors. This military excellence translated into consistent battlefield victories that reinforced Spartan hegemony throughout the Peloponnese. At Tegea in 473 BC, a Spartan force defeated a coalition of Arcadian cities attempting to challenge Lacedaemonian dominance, demonstrating that even coordinated resistance proved futile against superior training and discipline. The battle itself lasted less than an hour, with Spartan phalanxes breaking through enemy lines with methodical efficiency, while allied contingents pursued fleeing survivors across the Arcadian plain. Such victories reinforced the perception of Spartan invincibility while discouraging potential rebellions among subject populations. Despite this military dominance, Spartan foreign policy during the peak period exhibited characteristic caution regarding overseas commitments and prolonged expeditions beyond the Peloponnese. The Spartan leadership recognized that their military system, optimized for short, decisive campaigns, faced significant limitations when extended over vast distances or lengthy time periods. The citizen-soldier model that produced superior battlefield performance also created constraints on campaign duration, as prolonged absence from Sparta threatened both domestic stability and the agricultural supervision necessary for economic continuity. The Helot system, while providing the economic foundation for military excellence, also created vulnerabilities that limited strategic flexibility. Extended overseas campaigns reduced the number of armed citizens available for domestic security, potentially encouraging Helot uprisings that could threaten the entire social structure. The memory of the Great Helot Revolt following the earthquake of 464 BC remained fresh in Spartan minds, serving as a constant reminder that internal security required continuous attention and substantial military resources. This strategic caution manifested in Sparta's reluctance to pursue aggressive expansion beyond traditional spheres of influence. While Athenian ambitions extended across the Mediterranean, from Egypt to the Black Sea, Spartan interests remained focused on maintaining hegemony within the Peloponnese and preventing the emergence of rival power centres in central or northern Greece. This conservative approach reflected not weakness or lack of ambition, but a realistic assessment of capabilities and limitations that prioritised sustainable dominance over spectacular but potentially ruinous adventures. The few overseas expeditions that Sparta did undertake during this period demonstrated both the potential and the problems of extended military operations. The intervention in Egypt during the 450s, supporting a Persian satrap against Athenian-backed rebels, revealed the difficulties of maintaining supply lines and communication across vast distances while coordinating with unreliable allies. Although Spartan forces performed well in individual engagements, the overall campaign achieved limited results and reinforced leadership preferences for regional rather than imperial strategies. The conservative strategic approach that had served Sparta so effectively during its hegemonic peak faced its ultimate test when diplomatic tensions with Athens escalated beyond the point of peaceful resolution. The outbreak of hostilities in 431 BC confronted Spartan leadership with a fundamentally different type of conflict than any they had previously encountered. Unlike the brief, decisive campaigns that had characterized Peloponnesian warfare for generations, this struggle would demand sustained military effort across multiple theatres while challenging every assumption about Spartan strategic doctrine. The fundamental asymmetry between Spartan and Athenian military capabilities created a strategic puzzle that neither side initially understood how to solve. Sparta's land-based military machine, optimized for crushing enemy phalanxes and single decisive battles, found itself confronting an opponent whose strength lay in naval supremacy and the ability to avoid direct confrontation on Spartan terms. The Athenian strategy, conceived by Pericles and refined through bitter experience, centered on using naval dominance to maintain supply lines, while forcing Sparta to exhaust itself in futile attempts to bring the conflict to a decisive conclusion through traditional, hoplite warfare. The annual invasions of Attica that mark the war's opening phase reveal the limitations of Spartan strategic thinking when faced with an enemy unwilling to accept conventional battle. Each spring, King Archidamus led substantial Peloponnesian armies across the Attic border, devastating farmland and destroying olive groves with methodical thoroughness. The sight of these forces advancing across the Attic plain, their bronze armour glinting in the morning sun while smoke columns rose from burning villages, represented the traditional Spartan approach to warfare: inflict sufficient economic damage to force the enemy into battle on advantageous terms. Yet the Athenians, secure behind their long walls and supplied by their maritime empire, refused to emerge from their fortifications to defend their countryside. The psychological impact of watching their ancestral lands burn while remaining passive within the city walls created enormous internal pressure, but Athenian leadership maintained their strategic patience despite popular anger and demands for aggressive action. This disciplined refusal to engage in hoplite combat on Spartan terms transformed what should have been a brief conflict into a prolonged struggle of attrition that gradually exposed fundamental weaknesses in the Spartan military system. The demographic constraints that limited Spartan strategic flexibility became increasingly apparent as the war extended beyond its anticipated duration. The full citizen body, numbering fewer than 8,000 adult males capable of military service, could not sustain the casualties inevitable in prolonged warfare without compromising the social structure that made Spartan military excellence possible. Each Spartiate killed in battle represented not merely an individual loss, but the elimination of an entire family line and the reduction of the citizen body that maintained control over the vastly larger Helot population. The Battle of Pylos in 425 BC demonstrated how Athenian naval mobility could exploit these demographic vulnerabilities through innovative tactical approaches. When an Athenian fleet under Demosthenes established a fortified position on the Messenian coast, traditional Spartan responses proved inadequate against an enemy that combined naval supremacy with defensive fortifications. The subsequent entrapment of 420 Spartan hoplites on the nearby island of Sphacteria created an unprecedented crisis for Lacedaemonian leadership, as the potential loss of so many full citizens threatened to upset the delicate balance between Spartiates and Helots. The psychological impact of this crisis extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. For generations, Spartan military doctrine had emphasized the principle that death in battle was preferable to surrender or retreat. Yet the prospect of losing nearly 5% of the entire citizen body in a single engagement forced a reconsideration of traditional values. The 292 survivors who eventually surrendered to Athenian forces returned to Sparta bearing the stigma of capture, their presence serving as a constant reminder that Spartan military invincibility was neither absolute nor sustainable under all circumstances. The Peace of Nicias, concluded in 421 BC after a decade of inconclusive warfare, represented an acknowledgement by both sides that their initial strategic assumptions had proven fundamentally flawed. The treaty's complex provisions, including prisoner exchanges and territorial adjustments, reflected the war's indecisive character while failing to address the underlying causes of Athenian-Spartan rivalry. For Sparta, the peace offered a crucial opportunity to address internal problems that had accumulated during 10 years of continuous military operations, including growing Helot unrest and the increasing financial strain of maintaining large armies in the field. The demographic costs of the first phase of the war had already begun to manifest in subtle but significant ways throughout Spartan society. The traditional age cohorts that formed the backbone of the phalanx showed noticeable gaps where casualties had eliminated entire groups of men who had trained together since childhood. The surviving members of these depleted units faced increased military burdens as they compensated for absent comrades, while the overall reduction in citizen numbers placed additional pressure on those responsible for Helot supervision and domestic security. The economic implications of prolonged warfare created equally serious challenges for a society that had traditionally avoided extensive monetary transactions. The cost of maintaining armies in the field, providing equipment for allied contingents, and compensating for reduced agricultural productivity strained resources that had previously seemed adequate for all military requirements. The Helot system, while continuing to provide basic subsistence, could not generate the liquid wealth necessary for extended campaigns or the purchase of naval vessels and siege equipment that modern warfare increasingly required. The resumption of hostilities following the collapse of the Nicias peace revealed how little either side had learned from the previous decade's experiences. The Sicilian expedition, launched by Athens in 415 BC with unprecedented ambition and resources, offered Sparta an unexpected opportunity to exploit Athenian overextension through strategic partnerships that violated traditional principles of Lacedaemonian foreign policy. The decision to support Syracuse against Athenian invasion forces marked a significant departure from the conservative isolationism that had previously characterized Spartan international relations. The dispatch of Gylippus to Sicily in 414 BC represented a calculated risk that demonstrated both the potential and the dangers of extended overseas operations. This experienced Spartan commander, accompanied by a small force of Lacedaemonian officers and allied troops, succeeded in transforming the Syracusan resistance from a disorganized defensive effort into an effective military force capable of challenging Athenian siege operations. The tactical innovations that Gylippus introduced, including coordinated land and sea attacks against Athenian fortifications, proved decisive in preventing the capture of Syracuse and ultimately destroying the entire Athenian expedition. Yet the success of this intervention came at significant cost to traditional Spartan principles regarding foreign entanglements. The resources committed to Sicilian operations, while relatively modest in absolute terms, represented a substantial investment for a state with limited financial reserves and competing domestic priorities. More importantly, the collaboration with Syracuse required ongoing diplomatic commitments that constrained Spartan freedom of action and created precedents for future overseas involvement that would prove increasingly difficult to resist. The destruction of the Athenian forces in Sicily during 413 BC created new strategic opportunities that Sparta proved unable to exploit effectively without abandoning fundamental aspects of its traditional military doctrine. The elimination of approximately 40,000 Athenian and allied troops, along with over 200 warships, should have provided decisive advantages for Spartan land forces operating in Attica and the Aegean. However, the realization of these advantages required naval capabilities and financial resources that exceeded traditional Lacedaemonian capacities. The establishment of a permanent fortified position at Deceleia in northern Attica during 413 BC marked a significant evolution in Spartan strategic thinking, Yet it also revealed the limitations of land-based approaches against an enemy whose strength derived from maritime resources. The year-round occupation of this position, advised by the exiled Athenian Alcibiades, disrupted Athenian agricultural production and silver mining operations, while providing a base for raids throughout the Attic countryside. The sight of smoke rising continuously from Athenian territory, visible from the walls of Athens itself, created psychological pressure that complemented the economic damage inflicted by constant military operations. However, the maintenance of this forward position required resources and manpower that strained Spartan capabilities while failing to achieve decisive strategic results. The garrison at Decelia, numbering several thousand troops including both Lacedaemonians and allies, consumed supplies that had to be transported across hostile territory while remaining vulnerable to Athenian counterattacks. The defensive fortifications, constructed with massive stone blocks and timber palisades, required constant maintenance and periodic reinforcement that diverted resources from other military operations. The decision to accept Persian financial assistance marked the most significant departure from traditional Spartan principles during the entire conflict. The negotiations with satrap Tissaphernes, conducted through intermediaries including the exiled Alcibiades, resulted in subsidies that enabled Sparta to construct and maintain naval forces capable of challenging Athenian maritime supremacy. The Persian gold that flowed into Spartan treasuries, estimated at over 5,000 talents during the war's final phase, provided the financial foundation for a naval building program that would have been impossible using domestic resources alone. This dependence on Persian funding created profound contradictions within Spartan policy and ideology. The same state that had led Greek resistance against Persian invasion now found itself accepting foreign subsidies in exchange for diplomatic concessions that undermined the autonomy of Greek cities in Asia Minor. The irony of this situation was not lost on contemporary observers, who noted that Sparta's struggle for Greek freedom against Athenian imperialism was being financed by the traditional enemy of all Greeks. The naval construction program funded by Persian gold transformed Sparta from a purely land-based power into a formidable maritime force. Yet this transformation came at enormous cost to traditional military culture. The recruitment and training of naval crews required skills and attitudes fundamentally different from those developed through the agoge system. Spartan citizens, trained from childhood for hoplite warfare, proved inadequate as rowers and sailors, necessitating the recruitment of foreign mercenaries and freed helots whose loyalty and motivation remained questionable. The Battle of Aegospotami in 405 BC demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of this Persian-funded naval strategy. The destruction of the remaining Athenian fleet, accomplished through careful positioning and tactical surprise rather than direct confrontation, effectively ended Athenian resistance and secured Spartan victory in the prolonged conflict. The sight of 180 captured Athenian triremes being towed into Spartan harbours, their bronze rams glinting in the afternoon sun while their crews faced execution or enslavement, marked the culmination of nearly 3 decades of warfare. Yet this decisive victory had been achieved through methods that violated core Spartan values regarding independence and self-reliance. The tactical success at Aegospotami resulted from the leadership of Lysander, whose personal relationships with Persian officials enabled the coordination of naval operations with foreign funding sources. The dependence on Persian gold, foreign crews, and innovative tactics that emphasized deception over direct confrontation represented a fundamental departure from traditional Lacedaemonian military culture. The demographic consequences of 27 years of warfare had reduced the Spartan citizen body to fewer than 3,000 adult males capable of military service. The casualties sustained in major battles, combined with the natural mortality that occurred during extended campaigns, had eliminated entire age cohorts and created gaps in the social structure that could not be easily filled. The surviving Spartiates faced increased military obligations while struggling to maintain control over a helot population that had grown increasingly restive during the prolonged absence of citizen supervisors. The economic costs of the prolonged conflict extended far beyond the immediate expenses of military operations. The traditional agricultural system that had supported Spartan society for centuries showed signs of strain as reduced citizen numbers limited the supervision necessary for optimal helot productivity. The introduction of monetary payments for military service, necessitated by the recruitment of foreign troops and naval crews, created inflationary pressures that disrupted established patterns of exchange and distribution. The victory over Athens, achieved at such enormous cost in blood and treasure, left Sparta in possession of an empire it was fundamentally unprepared to govern. The naval supremacy that had proven decisive in the war's final phase required ongoing financial commitments that exceeded traditional Lacedaemonian resources, while the administration of subject territories demanded administrative skills that Spartan institutions had never developed. The challenge of maintaining hegemony over an empire that stretched from the Aegean to Asia Minor would test every assumption about Spartan governance and military organization in the decades that followed. The bronze-prowed triremes that returned to Gythium harbour in the autumn of 404 BC carried more than victorious crews and captured Athenian standards. They bore the weight of an empire that Sparta had never intended to acquire. The naval supremacy that Lysander's fleet had secured at Aegospotami transformed the Lacedaemonians from regional hegemon into masters of territories stretching from the Hellespont to the shores of Asia Minor. The sight of tribute ships arriving weekly at Spartan ports, their holds filled with silver from Thracian mines and grain from the Propontis, represented wealth beyond traditional Spartan comprehension. Yet this prosperity masked fundamental contradictions that would ultimately prove fatal to Lacedaemonian power. The immediate challenge confronting Spartan leadership involved the administration of territories that had previously sustained the Athenian Empire through sophisticated bureaucratic mechanisms. The Delian League's complex tribute system, which had generated over 1,000 talents annually at its peak, required administrative expertise that Spartan institutions had never developed. The ephors found themselves overwhelmed by requests for judicial decisions from distant cities, while the Gerousia struggled to comprehend commercial disputes involving maritime trade routes and banking arrangements that bore no resemblance to traditional Peloponnesian agriculture. Lysander's solution to these administrative challenges involved the installation of harmosts in major subject cities, accompanied by governing councils of 10 men known as Dicaches. These Spartan governors, typically drawn from the Perioeci class, or younger citizens seeking advancement, received broad authority to maintain order and collect tribute while implementing policies designed to ensure continued loyalty to Lacedaemonian interests. The harmosts established their headquarters in commandeered buildings that had previously housed democratic institutions, their scarlet cloaks and bronze-tipped spears serving as visible symbols of Spartan authority in communities that had known Athenian rule for generations. The Dicaches represented an even more radical departure from traditional Spartan governance principles. These councils, composed of local oligarchs who had collaborated with Spartan forces during the war's final phase, received authority to overturn democratic decisions and redistribute property according to criteria that favoured pro-Spartan elements within each community. The sight of former democratic leaders being marched to execution while their estates were divided among Dicache members created resentment that extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass entire populations who had benefited from democratic institutions. The implementation of this system in major cities like Byzantium and Chalcedon revealed the inherent contradictions in Spartan imperial policy. The harmosts, lacking familiarity with local customs and commercial practices, frequently issued contradictory orders that disrupted established trade relationships and legal procedures. In Byzantium, the Spartan governors' attempt to regulate grain shipments according to Peloponnesian agricultural cycles created shortages that forced citizens to purchase food at inflated prices from Spartan-approved merchants. The resulting economic hardship, combined with the arbitrary nature of Dikashi rule, transformed communities that had initially welcomed liberation from Athenian control into centres of anti-Spartan resistance. The financial windfall generated by imperial tribute created unprecedented challenges for a society that had traditionally operated without extensive monetary transactions. The silver that flowed into Spartan treasuries, estimated at over 8,000 talents during the first 5 years of imperial rule, exceeded the state's capacity to manage effectively through existing institutions. The ephors, accustomed to overseeing barter exchanges and land tenure disputes, found themselves responsible for currency fluctuations and international banking relationships that required expertise they simply did not possess. The introduction of substantial monetary wealth into Spartan society began to undermine the egalitarian principles that had maintained social cohesion for centuries. Citizens who had previously lived on roughly equal terms through their helot-worked estates now found themselves divided between those with access to imperial profits and those dependent on traditional agricultural income. The sight of certain Spartiate families constructing elaborate houses with imported marble and bronze fittings, while their neighbours maintained the austere lifestyle mandated by traditional custom, created social tensions that threatened the unity essential for military effectiveness. The corruption that inevitably accompanied this influx of wealth manifested most clearly in the behaviour of harmosts and other officials serving in imperial territories. These representatives of Spartan authority, far from the oversight of ephors and Gerousia, frequently enriched themselves through arrangements with local merchants and tribute collectors. Reports reached Sparta describing harmosts who demanded personal payments beyond official tribute requirements, while others accumulated private fortunes through partnerships with traders seeking favourable commercial terms. The most serious challenge to Spartan imperial administration emerged from the growing resentment of former Athenian allies who discovered that Lacedaemonian rule proved even more oppressive than the democratic imperialism they'd recently escaped. The island communities of the Aegean, which had contributed ships and crews to the Delian League while maintaining substantial internal autonomy, found themselves subject to direct Spartan control through harmosts who understood neither maritime commerce nor island politics. The transformation of Mytilene's harbour into a Spartan naval base, complete with fortifications and permanent garrison, symbolised the heavy-handed approach that characterised Lacedaemonian imperial policy throughout the region. The Ionian cities presented particularly complex administrative challenges that exposed the limitations of Spartan governance capabilities. These prosperous commercial centres, with their mixed Greek and Persian populations, sophisticated banking systems, and extensive trade networks, required nuanced political management that respected local traditions while maintaining imperial control. The harmos dispatched to cities like Miletos and Ephesos, trained in the rigid hierarchies of Spartan military culture, proved incapable of managing the delicate negotiations necessary to maintain prosperity while ensuring loyalty. The economic disruption caused by clumsy Spartan administration manifested clearly in the declining tribute revenues that began to characterise imperial territories within 5 years of the war's conclusion. Cities that had contributed substantial sums to Athenian treasuries found their commercial activities constrained by Spartan regulations that prioritised political control over economic productivity. The port facilities at Ephesos, which had handled hundreds of ships monthly during the Athenian period, saw traffic decline by nearly half as merchants sought alternative routes that avoided Spartan taxation and bureaucratic interference. The military requirements of imperial administration strained Spartan manpower resources that had already been severely depleted by the Peloponnesian War's casualties. The garrison troops necessary to maintain control over distant territories, estimated at over 10,000 men distributed across dozens of strategic positions, included substantial numbers of Spartiates whose absence from the Peloponnese weakened domestic security arrangements. The Helot population, left with reduced citizen supervision, began to exhibit signs of unrest that manifested in work slowdowns, minor acts of sabotage, and the emergence of clandestine organisations that maintained contact across different agricultural estates. The Corinthian War, which erupted in 395 BC, demonstrated how Spartan overextension had created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit through coordinated action. The coalition that formed against Spartan hegemony included not only traditional rivals like Athens and Thebes, but also former allies such as Corinth, whose loyalty had been eroded by heavy-handed imperial policies. The sight of Corinthian hoplites, their bronze-faced shields bearing the Pegasus emblem, standing in battle line against Spartan phalanxes at Nemea, represented a fundamental shift in Greek political alignments that reflected widespread dissatisfaction with Lacedaemonian rule. The Battle of Haliartus, fought in the war's opening phase, revealed how imperial commitments had weakened traditional Spartan military capabilities. King Lysander, advancing with a force that included substantial numbers of Periecae and allied troops to compensate for reduced Spartiate availability, fell victim to a Theban ambush that eliminated one of Sparta's most experienced commanders, along with several hundred veteran soldiers. The loss of these irreplaceable military assets, combined with the psychological impact of Lysander's death, demonstrated how imperial responsibilities had stretched Spartan resources beyond sustainable limits. The Persian decision to support the anti-Spartan coalition with substantial financial assistance created a strategic nightmare that Lacedaemonian leadership proved incapable of resolving through traditional military methods. The gold that Pharnabazus and other Persian officials provided to Athens and its allies enabled the reconstruction of naval forces that challenged Spartan maritime supremacy, while funding mercenary armies that could match Lacedaemonian hoplites in both size and equipment quality. The irony of this situation, Sparta finding itself opposed by the same Persian resources that had enabled its victory over Athens, was not lost on observers who noted how imperial ambitions had transformed liberators into oppressors. The naval engagement at Cnidus in 394 BC marked the effective end of Spartan maritime dominance and demonstrated the fragility of imperial power based on military superiority alone. The destruction of the Lacedaemonian fleet by a combined Persian and Athenian force eliminated the naval supremacy that had made imperial administration possible, while the death of the Spartan Navarch Peisander removed another experienced commander whose expertise could not be easily replaced. The sight of Spartan triremes burning in the harbour while their bronze rams were claimed as trophies by victorious enemies symbolised the collapse of imperial pretensions that had never possessed sustainable foundations. The diplomatic revolution that followed this naval defeat forced Sparta to abandon its traditional independence and seek Persian support through negotiations that violated fundamental principles of Greek autonomy. The King's Peace, concluded in 387 BC through Persian mediation, represented a humiliating acknowledgement that Lacedaemonian power could only be maintained through foreign assistance. The treaty's provisions, which guaranteed Persian control over Greek cities in Asia Minor while confirming Spartan hegemony in Greece proper, created a diplomatic framework that subordinated Greek interests to Persian imperial policy. The implementation of the King's Peace required Sparta to act as Persian enforcer against Greek cities that resisted the treaty's terms, transforming the former champion of Greek freedom into an agent of barbarian imperialism. The siege of Mantinea in 385 BC conducted to break up a democratic federation that Persian diplomats considered threatening, demonstrated how thoroughly Spartan policy had become subordinated to foreign interests. The sight of Lacedaemonian engineers diverting the Ophis River to flood Mantinean fortifications, while Persian observers monitored the operation's progress, represented the complete abandonment of traditional Spartan principles regarding Greek autonomy. The internal consequences of this diplomatic dependence manifested in growing tensions between traditional Spartan values and the requirements of imperial administration. The citizen assembly, accustomed to making decisions based on Lacedaemonian interests alone, found itself constrained by Persian diplomatic preferences that frequently conflicted with regional security concerns. The ephors, whose authority derived from their role as guardians of traditional law, struggled to reconcile their constitutional obligations with the compromises necessary to maintain Persian support. The relationship with Thebes, which had emerged as the primary challenger to Spartan hegemony in central Greece, illustrated the limitations of Persian-backed diplomacy in resolving fundamental conflicts between Greek powers. The Thebans, whose military capabilities had been dramatically enhanced through democratic reforms and tactical innovations, refused to accept the subordinate status that the king's peace attempted to impose. The fortification of the Cadmea by Spartan forces in 382 BC, ostensibly to prevent Theban violations of the peace treaty, created a permanent source of tension that Persian mediation proved incapable of resolving. The seizure of the Theban citadel marked another departure from traditional Spartan military practice, which had historically avoided permanent occupation of Greek cities in favour of decisive battles followed by negotiated settlements. The garrison established in the Cadmea, numbering over 1,500 troops, including a substantial Spartiate contingent, represented a significant drain on military resources while creating a vulnerable position that enemies could exploit. The sight of Lacedaemonian sentries patrolling the ancient fortress that dominated Thebes, their bronze-tipped spears glinting in the morning sun while hostile citizens gathered in the agora below, symbolized the transformation of Sparta from liberator into occupying power. The economic costs of maintaining imperial commitments while defending against multiple enemies strained Spartan resources to the breaking point. The tribute revenues that had initially seemed to provide unlimited wealth proved inadequate to support the military forces necessary for effective imperial control, while the disruption of traditional agricultural patterns reduced domestic productivity. The Helot system, stressed by reduced citizen supervision and increased demands for military service, began to show signs of systematic breakdown that threatened the economic foundation of Spartan society. The demographic crisis that had emerged during the Peloponnesian War continued to worsen under the pressures of imperial administration and renewed warfare. The Spartiate population, reduced to fewer than 2,500 adult males by 385 BC, could no longer provide adequate numbers for both domestic security and overseas commitments. The increasing reliance on Perioeci troops and freed helots for military service diluted the quality advantages that had traditionally compensated for Spartan numerical inferiority, while creating command structures that lacked the cohesion essential for effective phalanx combat. The bronze doors of the Ephorate building swung shut behind the trembling informant, whose revelations would expose the most serious internal threat to Spartan society since the Great Helot Revolt of the 460s. In the flickering light of oil lamps, the 5 ephors listened with growing alarm as details emerged of a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of their supposedly impregnable social order. The plot, conceived and organized by Synodon, a young man of the Hypermaenes class, who possessed neither full citizenship nor the economic security that accompanied Spartiate status, represented far more than simple political rebellion. It revealed the systematic breakdown of social cohesion that centuries of military success had concealed beneath a facade of traditional discipline. Cynodon himself embodied the contradictions that increasingly characterized Spartan society in the aftermath of imperial expansion. Born to a Spartiate father who had lost his citizenship through inability to maintain his mess contributions, he possessed the military training and cultural identity of a full citizen, while being denied the political rights and economic privileges that such status normally entailed. His physical appearance, tall, broad-shouldered, with the distinctive scars that marked graduates of the Agogis system, made his exclusion from citizen ranks particularly galling to both himself and others who observed the arbitrary nature of social distinctions that had once seemed natural and immutable. The conspiracy that Cynodon organized drew support from multiple segments of Spartan society that had previously remained isolated from one another through careful institutional arrangements. The Hypomenes, numbering perhaps 2,000 individuals who had lost or never achieved full citizenship despite their Spartan birth, provided the leadership and coordination necessary for effective resistance. These men possessed intimate knowledge of Spartan military procedures and social customs, having been raised within the system they now sought to overthrow, yet their exclusion from political participation had created resentments that festered beneath the surface of apparent social harmony. The Perietsi communities, which had traditionally provided loyal military service in exchange for local autonomy and protection from Helot uprisings, began to question their subordinate status as imperial burdens increased without corresponding benefits. The artisans and merchants of Gythium, who crafted the bronze armour and iron weapons that equipped Spartan armies, found themselves subject to increased taxation and labour conscription while being denied any voice in decisions that affected their livelihoods. The sight of their finest metalwork being shipped to imperial garrisons, while their own communities struggled with inadequate defences, created resentments that Cynodon's agents skillfully exploited. The Helot population, estimated at over 180,000 individuals scattered across Laconia and Messenia, represented the conspiracy's most dangerous element due to their overwhelming numerical superiority and intimate knowledge of Spartan vulnerabilities. The agricultural workers who tended the olive groves and grain fields that fed the citizen population had observed the gradual reduction in Spartiate numbers while noting the increasing absence of their masters on imperial duties. The domestic servants who maintained Spartan households possessed detailed information about family structures, economic resources, and defensive preparations that would prove invaluable in coordinating simultaneous uprisings across multiple locations. The Neodamodes freed Helots who had earned limited citizenship through military service occupied a particularly crucial position within the conspiracy's organizational structure. These individuals, numbering several thousand veterans of recent campaigns, possessed both military training and legitimate access to weapons, while maintaining connections with their former communities. Their participation in Spartan military operations had provided them with knowledge of tactical procedures and strategic planning that could be turned against their former masters, while their ambiguous social status allowed them to move freely between different segments of society without arousing suspicion. The economic grievances that fueled the conspiracy reflected fundamental changes in Spartan society that had accelerated during the imperial period. The traditional system of land tenure, which had provided roughly equal allotments to all Spartiates, had been gradually undermined by inheritance practices that concentrated holdings among fewer families. The wealthier citizens now controlled estates that included dozens of Helot families and generated annual surpluses measured in thousands of medimnoi of grain, while their poorer neighbours struggled to maintain the minimum contributions required for mess participation. This growing inequality manifested most clearly in the quality of military equipment that different Spartiates could afford to maintain. The bronze panoply that had once marked all citizens as equals now displayed obvious variations in craftsmanship and materials that reflected the economic disparities emerging within the citizen body. Some warriors appeared on the training grounds wearing elaborately decorated breastplates with silver inlays and perfectly fitted helmets crafted by the finest perioeci artisans, while others made do with patched armour and weapons that showed signs of extensive repair and reuse. The mess system, which had traditionally reinforced social equality through shared meals and common contributions, began to reflect these economic divisions in ways that undermined its original purpose. The wealthier members of certain messes could afford to supplement the basic rations with imported delicacies and fine wines, while their poorer colleagues struggled to meet even the minimum contribution requirements. The sight of citizens being excluded from mess participation due to economic hardship, despite their military valour and social standing, created visible reminders of the arbitrary nature of distinctions that had once seemed based on merit and character. The agoga system itself showed signs of systematic deterioration that reflected broader social changes affecting Spartan society. The traditional barracks where young men had lived in Spartan simplicity now displayed obvious variations in comfort and amenities that reflected their families' economic status. Some dormitories featured improved bedding, better heating arrangements, and supplementary food supplies provided by wealthy relatives, while others maintained the harsh conditions that had traditionally characterized the entire system. These disparities created resentments among the younger generation that extended beyond immediate material concerns to encompass fundamental questions about the fairness and legitimacy of social arrangements. The educational content of the agoge had also been modified in ways that reflected the practical requirements of imperial administration, rather than the traditional emphasis on military virtue and civic responsibility. Young Spartans now received instruction in accounting procedures, foreign languages and commercial law that prepared them for service as harmists and tribute collectors, while the time devoted to physical conditioning and weapons training was correspondingly reduced. The sight of teenage Spartiates hunched over writing tablets, learning to calculate currency exchanges and draft commercial contracts, represented a fundamental departure from the warrior culture that had made Spartan military supremacy possible. The corruption that had begun to characterize the ephorate represented perhaps the most serious threat to traditional Spartan governance, as it undermined the institutional checks and balances that had maintained political stability for centuries. The annual election of ephors, which had traditionally been based on personal reputation and demonstrated commitment to Spartan values, increasingly reflected the influence of wealthy families who could provide financial incentives to voters. The sight of candidates distributing gifts and promising favourable decisions to specific interest groups violated fundamental principles of Spartan political culture while creating precedents for further deterioration. The ephors' judicial decisions began to reflect these corrupt influences in ways that undermined confidence in traditional legal procedures. Cases involving property disputes between wealthy and poor Spartiates increasingly favoured those with greater economic resources, while criminal prosecutions seemed to depend more on social connections than factual evidence. The helots and perioeci observed these developments with growing cynicism, noting that the justice system that claimed to maintain social order actually served to protect the privileges of an increasingly narrow elite. The Gerousia, composed of elderly Spartiates who had theoretically proven their wisdom through decades of service, found itself dominated by representatives of the wealthiest families who could afford to maintain their political careers into advanced age. The traditional respect for elderly counsel gave way to recognition that many gerontas represented narrow economic interests rather than broader community welfare. The sight of aged senators nodding off during crucial deliberations while their younger relatives whispered instructions about upcoming votes symbolized the institutional decay that affected even the most revered aspects of Spartan governance. The religious institutions that had traditionally reinforced social cohesion through shared rituals and common beliefs also showed signs of corruption and neglect that reflected broader social changes. The festivals that had once brought together all segments of society in celebration of Spartan achievements now displayed obvious class distinctions in the quality of offerings and the prominence of seating arrangements. The wealthy families could afford elaborate sacrifices and prominent positions during religious ceremonies, while poorer citizens found themselves relegated to peripheral roles that emphasized their declining status within the community. The Hyacinthia Festival, which had traditionally celebrated the unity of Spartan society through 3 days of shared activities, became a showcase for economic inequality that highlighted social divisions rather than promoting communal solidarity. The processions that wound through the streets of Sparta now featured obvious disparities in the quality of clothing, jewellery and ceremonial equipment that participants could afford, while the communal feast displayed variations in food quality and service arrangements that reflected economic status rather than civic equality. The conspiracy that Synodon organised exploited these social tensions through careful planning that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Spartan vulnerabilities. The plot's timing, scheduled to coincide with the Hyacinthia Festival when large numbers of citizens would be gathered in public spaces, reflected strategic thinking that took advantage of religious traditions while turning them against the social order they were meant to support. The conspirators planned to begin their uprising during the festival's climactic procession, when the dispersal of armed Spartiates throughout the city would prevent effective resistance to coordinated attacks on key installations. The organisational structure that Synodon established revealed the extent to which traditional social barriers had broken down under the pressure of economic inequality and imperial overextension. The conspiracy included representatives from every segment of society except the full Spartiates, creating a coalition that encompassed roughly 95% of the population within Spartan territory. The Helots provided numerical strength and intimate knowledge of agricultural resources, while the Perioeci contributed technical expertise and access to weapons manufacturing facilities. The Hypomeones and Neodamodes supplied military leadership and detailed knowledge of Spartan defensive arrangements. The weapons cache that conspirators accumulated reflected both the scope of their preparations and the systemic failures of Spartan internal security arrangements. Hidden in caves throughout Mount Taygetus and buried beneath the floors of Perioeci workshops, these stockpiles included thousands of iron spearheads, bronze sword blades, and leather armour pieces that had been diverted from official production quotas over several months. The sight of these hidden arsenals, discovered during the investigation that followed the conspiracy's exposure, revealed how thoroughly the traditional systems of oversight and control had been compromised by corruption and neglect. The intelligence network that supported the conspiracy demonstrated sophisticated coordination between communities that had previously maintained minimal contact with one another. Helot agricultural workers served as messengers between different regions, using their legitimate travel requirements to maintain communication between scattered groups of conspirators. Perioeci merchants provided cover for meetings and weapons transfers, while their commercial activities allowed them to assess the loyalty and capabilities of potential supporters throughout Laconia and Messenia. The exposure of the conspiracy through an informant's revelation prevented what could have been the complete destruction of Spartan society, yet the investigation that followed revealed the extent to which internal decay had progressed beyond the point of easy remedy. The interrogations conducted by the ephors uncovered evidence of widespread dissatisfaction that extended far beyond the immediate conspirators to encompass substantial portions of the population that had previously seemed loyal and content. The discovery that even some Spartiate families had been aware of the plot's existence without reporting it to authorities demonstrated how thoroughly traditional bonds of loyalty and civic responsibility had been eroded. The executions that followed the conspiracy's exposure, including Synodon himself along with dozens of his primary supporters, eliminated the immediate threat while failing to address the underlying conditions that had made such a plot possible. The sight of these men being led to their deaths, their bronze shackles glinting in the morning sun while crowds gathered to witness the restoration of traditional order, provided temporary reassurance to the remaining Spartiates while serving as a warning to potential future conspirators. Yet the demographic impact of these executions, which eliminated several hundred individuals from an already depleted population, further weakened the social structure that the punishments were intended to protect. The investigation's revelations about the extent of social decay forced Spartan leadership to confront fundamental questions about the sustainability of their traditional institutions under the pressures of imperial administration and internal inequality. The citizen body, reduced to fewer than 2,000 adult males capable of military service, could no longer maintain effective control over a helot population that outnumbered them by more than 90 to 1. The economic disparities that had emerged within the Spartiate class undermined the solidarity essential for effective governance, while the corruption that characterized political institutions eroded confidence in traditional authority structures. The economic disparities that had emerged within the Spartiate class undermined the solidarity essential for effective governance, while the corruption that characterized political institutions eroded confidence in traditional authority structures. Yet even as internal decay threatened the foundations of Lacedaemonian society, external challenges were emerging that would test Spartan military supremacy in ways that traditional tactical doctrine had never anticipated. In the hills surrounding Thebes, a new generation of military innovators was developing revolutionary approaches to hoplite warfare that would shatter centuries of assumptions about battlefield superiority and expose the fundamental weaknesses that imperial overextension had created within the Spartan military system. The transformation of Theban military capabilities began with the demographic and political changes that paralleled but differed significantly from the internal decay affecting Spartan society. The democratic revolution that had expelled Spartan-backed oligarchs from Theban governance in 379 BC created unprecedented opportunities for military innovation by eliminating the conservative aristocratic leadership that had traditionally limited tactical experimentation. The new democratic assembly, composed of citizens who had experienced Spartan occupation firsthand, possessed both the motivation and political authority necessary to support radical departures from conventional military practice. The Sacred Band, established around 378 BC under the leadership of Gorgidas and later perfected by Pelopidas, represented the most visible manifestation of this innovative approach to military organisation. This elite unit of 300 men, organised into 150 pairs of lovers bound together by emotional as well as military ties, challenged traditional Greek assumptions about the relationship between personal affection and battlefield effectiveness. The sight of these warriors training in the gymnasium outside Thebes, their bronze-muscled bodies glistening with olive oil as they practiced intricate sword combinations and shield manoeuvres, attracted observers from throughout central Greece who marvelled at the intensity and coordination of their exercises. The psychological foundation that sustained the Sacred Band rested on philosophical principles that differed fundamentally from the institutional loyalty that characterized Spartan military culture. Where Lacedaemonian warriors fought for abstract concepts of honor and state authority, the Theban elite drew motivation from personal bonds that made individual survival dependent on protecting their beloved companions. The training regimen that Pelopidas developed emphasized tactical coordination between paired fighters, with each man learning to anticipate his partner's movements while providing mutual protection through overlapping shield work and coordinated spear thrusts. The equipment that distinguished Sacred Band members reflected both their elite status and the specific tactical requirements of their innovative fighting style. Their bronze breastplates, crafted by the finest Boeotian metal workers, featured articulated joints that allowed greater freedom of movement than traditional hoplite armour, while their shields bore distinctive devices that identified each warrior's partner and position within the unit's organisational structure. The iron spearheads they carried, forged with a distinctive leaf-shaped blade design, provided superior penetrating power against bronze armour while maintaining the balance necessary for precise thrusting techniques. The tactical innovations that emerged from sacred band training sessions influenced broader developments in Theban military doctrine that would prove decisive in confronting Spartan phalanx formations. The traditional emphasis on maintaining rigid linear formations gave way to more flexible approaches that emphasized concentrated attacks against specific points in enemy battle lines. The Theban commanders observed that Spartan phalanxes, despite their legendary discipline, maintained predictable formations that created vulnerabilities for opponents willing to abandon conventional tactical assumptions. Epaminondas, whose strategic genius would ultimately orchestrate the systematic dismantling of Spartan power, emerged from this environment of military innovation with insights that transcended purely tactical considerations. His background as a philosopher and mathematician provided analytical tools that he applied to military problems with unprecedented rigour, while his democratic political convictions motivated him to develop strategies that could overcome the aristocratic military traditions that had dominated Greek warfare for centuries. The sight of this tall, lean figure walking through Theban training grounds, his penetrating gaze analysing formation movements while his hands gestured to illustrate geometric principles, became familiar to the citizen soldiers who would implement his revolutionary tactical concepts. The deep phalanx formation that Epaminondas developed represented a radical departure from the balanced battle lines that had characterized hoplite warfare since the Archaic period. Instead of distributing forces evenly across the entire front, the Theban system concentrated overwhelming strength on the left wing while refusing engagement along the remainder of the line. This asymmetrical approach created local numerical superiority that could break through enemy formations before opposing commanders could respond with tactical adjustments. The mathematical precision that governed these deployments reflected Epaminondas's analytical approach to military problems, with specific ratios of depth to width calculated to maximize impact force while maintaining unit cohesion. The training required to implement this tactical system demanded unprecedented levels of coordination and discipline from citizen soldiers who had traditionally fought as individual warriors within loose phalanx formations. The Theban hoplites spent months practicing the complex maneuvers necessary to maintain alignment, while advancing in columns 50 ranks deep, their bronze-tipped spears creating a forest of gleaming points that extended far beyond the reach of conventional 8-rank formations. The sight of these dense formations wheeling across the training fields outside Thebes, their bronze-faced shields catching the afternoon sunlight, while dust clouds marked their passage, demonstrated the transformation of military capability that democratic innovation had made possible. The psychological impact of these deep formations extended beyond their immediate tactical advantages to encompass broader questions about the nature of military superiority and social organisation. The Theban system demonstrated that citizen soldiers, motivated by democratic principles and trained in innovative techniques, could match or exceed the performance of professional warriors whose entire lives had been devoted to military preparation. This revelation challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between social structure and military effectiveness that had supported aristocratic dominance throughout the Greek world. The intelligence gathering that supported Theban military planning revealed systematic weaknesses in Spartan defensive arrangements that reflected the demographic and organizational problems created by imperial overextension. Theban agents operating throughout the Peloponnese reported declining numbers of full Spartiates available for military service, increasing reliance on Perioeci and allied troops whose loyalty remained questionable, and growing internal tensions that limited the effectiveness of traditional command structures. The detailed reports that reached Epaminondas described garrison strengths, supply arrangements, and communication procedures that provided crucial information for planning offensive operations. The diplomatic preparations that preceded military action demonstrated Epaminondas's understanding that tactical innovation alone would prove insufficient to overcome Spartan advantages in resources and alliance relationships. The Theban leadership cultivated relationships with disaffected elements throughout the Greek world, including democratic factions within oligarchic cities, Helot communities seeking liberation from Spartan control, and Persian officials interested in weakening Greek unity. These negotiations required sophisticated understanding of regional politics and careful coordination of promises and commitments that would maintain coalition unity during prolonged military campaigns. The mobilization of Boeotian military resources for confrontation with Sparta revealed the extent to which democratic governance could generate citizen enthusiasm for military service that exceeded the capabilities of traditional aristocratic systems. The Theban assembly voted unprecedented funding for military equipment and training, while citizens volunteered for extended service periods that demonstrated commitment levels comparable to those achieved through Spartan institutional compulsion. The sight of farmers and artisans drilling with bronze-tipped spears in village squares throughout Boeotia, their rough hands learning to grip shield handles while their weathered faces showed grim determination, illustrated the popular mobilization that democratic leadership had achieved. The strategic situation that developed during 371 BC created optimal conditions for testing Theban military innovations against Spartan conventional superiority. The diplomatic crisis that emerged from competing claims regarding Messenian autonomy provided justification for military action, while the concentration of Spartan forces in central Greece offered opportunities for decisive engagement under conditions that favoured Theban tactical advantages. The march of King Cleombrotus toward Boeotia, with approximately 10,000 troops, including 700 Spartiates and substantial allied contingents, represented exactly the type of conventional military response that Epaminondas had anticipated and prepared to counter. The Battle of Leuctra, fought on July 6, 371 BC, began with deployments that appeared to follow traditional patterns while concealing the revolutionary tactical approach that would transform Greek military history. The Spartan forces, arranged in conventional formation with Lacedaemonians, holding the position of honour on the right wing, faced what seemed to be a standard Theban battle line extending across the plain between low hills that flanked the battlefield. The morning sun, rising behind the Theban position, cast long shadows across the field while bronze armour glinted along both formations as commanders made final preparations for engagement. The initial movements that preceded direct combat revealed the first indications of Theban tactical innovation as Epaminondas concentrated his forces in an unprecedented deep formation on his left wing. The sight of Theban ranks massing 50 men deep, their bronze shields overlapping to create an impenetrable wall, while their spear points projected in serried ranks, confused Spartan observers who had never encountered such concentrated formations. The sacred band, positioned at the front of this massive column, advanced with mechanical precision, while their distinctive armour and synchronized movements marked them as the elite spearhead of the assault. The moment of contact between the opposing forces shattered traditional assumptions about the relationship between individual warrior quality and battlefield outcomes. The Theban left wing, concentrated into a battering ram of bronze and iron, struck the Spartan right with overwhelming force that no amount of individual courage or training could withstand. The sight of Lacedaemonian warriors, their scarlet cloaks streaming behind them as they fell beneath the crushing weight of the Theban assault, marked the end of an era in which Spartan military reputation had seemed invincible. King Cleombrotus himself fell during the initial moments of the melee, his bronze-armoured body disappearing beneath the press of Theban spears as the sacred band carved through the Spartan formation with methodical efficiency. The death of the king, along with approximately 400 Spartiates who died attempting to protect his body, eliminated nearly 20% of the entire citizen class in a single engagement. The sight of these elite warriors lying motionless on the bloodied ground, their bronze armour dented and their scarlet cloaks stained with dust and gore, provided visual confirmation that Spartan military supremacy had ended forever. The collapse of the Spartan right wing created panic throughout the Allied contingents that had traditionally drawn confidence from Lacedaemonian presence on the battlefield. The Tegeans, Mantineans and other Peloponnesian allies who witnessed the destruction of supposedly invincible Spartan hoplites began to withdraw from their positions without waiting for orders, while their bronze-tipped spears and painted shields were abandoned in the rush to escape the battlefield. The sight of these allied formations dissolving into scattered groups of fleeing individuals demonstrated how thoroughly the myth of Spartan invincibility had supported the broader structure of Lacedaemonian hegemony. The immediate aftermath of Leuctra revealed the strategic implications of tactical innovation when applied with systematic intelligence and careful preparation. The Theban victory had eliminated not merely an army, but the psychological foundation that had sustained Spartan dominance throughout the Greek world for over a century. The bronze trophy that Epaminondas erected on the battlefield, decorated with captured Spartan armour and weapons, served as a permanent reminder that military superiority could be achieved through intellectual innovation rather than traditional aristocratic privilege. The news of the Spartan defeat spread throughout Greece with unprecedented speed, carried by merchants and travellers who had witnessed the battle's aftermath. The sight of Spartan survivors limping southward toward the Peloponnese, their bronze armour damaged and their scarlet cloaks torn, provided visual confirmation of reports that seemed too extraordinary to believe. The psychological impact of these images extended far beyond immediate military considerations to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of power and the possibility of change within established political systems. The liberation of Messenia, which Epaminondas accomplished during his first invasion of the Peloponnese in 370 BC, represented the systematic implementation of strategic concepts that extended tactical innovation into the realm of social and economic warfare. The Theban commander recognized that Spartan military power rested fundamentally on the helot labour system that provided economic support for citizen soldiers, and that permanent weakening of Lacedaemonian capabilities required the destruction of this exploitative relationship. The march of Theban forces into Messenia, accompanied by exiled Messenian leaders who had maintained their cultural identity despite centuries of subjugation, represented the transformation of military victory into comprehensive social revolution. The establishment of Messene as an independent polis, fortified with massive stone walls and garrisoned by Theban allies, eliminated the agricultural foundation that had supported Spartan society for over 3 centuries. The sight of former helots constructing their own civic institutions while armed with bronze-tipped spears and wearing the armour of free citizens, demonstrated the revolutionary potential that Epaminondas had unleashed through his strategic vision. The loss of Messenian agricultural production reduced Spartan economic capacity by approximately 40%, while the psychological impact of helot liberation threatened the stability of the remaining labour force in Laconia. The fortification of Messene revealed Epaminondas's understanding that military victories required permanent institutional changes to prevent the restoration of previous power relationships. The massive stone walls that surrounded the new city, constructed with blocks weighing several tons and rising to heights of over 30 feet, represented engineering capabilities that rivaled the greatest achievements of classical Greek architecture. The sight of these fortifications, their limestone blocks fitted with mathematical precision, while bronze-armoured sentries patrolled the ramparts, provided visual confirmation that Messenian independence possessed the military foundation necessary for long-term survival. The establishment of Megalopolis as a complementary fortress city in southern Arcadia completed the strategic encirclement that would permanently contain Spartan territorial expansion. The synoicism that created this new urban centre brought together populations from over 40 smaller Arcadian communities, their inhabitants abandoning ancestral villages to construct a massive fortified complex designed specifically to counter Lacedaemonian military capabilities. The sight of thousands of farmers, artisans and herders arriving with their possessions loaded onto ox-drawn carts, their bronze agricultural tools glinting alongside hastily forged weapons, demonstrated the popular mobilization that Theban diplomatic success had achieved throughout the Peloponnese. The urban planning that governed Megalopolis reflected sophisticated understanding of defensive requirements against Spartan tactical methods. The city's designers, working under Theban supervision, created a fortress complex that stretched across nearly 10 square kilometres, its massive stone walls incorporating natural terrain features while providing multiple defensive positions against besieging forces. The central agora, surrounded by stoas constructed with imported marble columns, served as both civic centre and military depot where bronze-tipped spears and leather-reinforced shields could be stored in quantities sufficient to arm the entire adult male population during emergency mobilizations. The agricultural territories that surrounded these new fortress cities encompassed some of the most productive farmland in the Peloponnese, their fertile valleys watered by mountain streams that had previously supported Spartan economic dominance. The redistribution of land ownership that accompanied a political liberation eliminated the helot system throughout Messenia, while establishing independent farming communities whose loyalty to their new political arrangements was guaranteed by their economic self-interest. The sight of former helots ploughing their own fields with bronze-tipped implements, their children playing freely in olive groves that had once belonged to Spartan masters, represented social transformation that extended far beyond immediate military considerations. The demographic calculations that supported these new settlements reveal the devastating impact of territorial losses on Spartan population sustainability. The liberation of Messenia eliminated agricultural estates that had supported approximately 2,000 Spartiate families, while the establishment of Megalopolis removed additional territories that had provided economic foundation for perhaps 800 more citizen households. The mathematical precision of these losses, calculated by Theban intelligence services that had carefully mapped Spartan land tenure patterns, demonstrated how systematic territorial reduction could achieve strategic objectives that military victories alone could never accomplish. The helot population that remained under Spartan control in Laconia faced unprecedented pressures as their labour became essential for maintaining even minimal citizen lifestyle standards. The agricultural estates along the Eurotas River Valley, which had previously represented only a portion of total Spartan economic resources, now bore responsibility for supporting the entire citizen population through increased production quotas and more intensive cultivation methods. The sight of helot families working longer hours in fields that showed signs of exhaustive farming practices, their bronze tools wearing thin from constant use, while their weathered faces reflected growing desperation, illustrated the unsustainable nature of the economic system that territorial losses had created. The military implications of this economic collapse manifested immediately in Sparta's inability to maintain traditional army sizes during subsequent campaigns. The muster of 378 BZ, conducted in response to Theban threats against remaining Laconian territories, revealed that fewer than 1,200 full Spartiates remained available for active military service. The formation that assembled in the ancient training grounds outside Sparta, their bronze-faced shields bearing the lambda emblem, that had once struck terror throughout Greece displayed obvious gaps where entire age cohorts had been eliminated through battlefield casualties or economic displacement. The Piraeus contingents that supplemented these reduced Spartiate numbers showed declining quality and questionable reliability, as their communities faced increased taxation and military service obligations without corresponding political benefits. The hoplites from Gythium and other coastal towns arrived at mobilization points with equipment that revealed economic strain, their bronze armour showing extensive repair work, while their iron spearheads displayed the rough finishing that characterized hasty production under resource constraints. The sight of these citizen soldiers examining their worn gear with obvious concern, their conversations revealing doubts about the sustainability of continued military service, demonstrated how thoroughly economic collapse had undermined traditional military culture. The Allied relationships that had previously provided substantial military reinforcement for Spartan campaigns began to dissolve as the political and economic foundations of Lacedaemonian hegemony crumbled. The Tegeans, whose bronze-armoured phalanxes had fought alongside Spartan forces for generations, formally withdrew from the Peloponnesian League in 370 BC after calculating that continued association offered no advantages that could compensate for the risks of supporting a declining power. The sight of Tegean ambassadors departing from Sparta after delivering formal notice of their withdrawal, their purple-bordered cloaks marking their diplomatic status, while their grim expressions reflected the finality of their decision, symbolized the broader collapse of alliance relationships throughout the region. The first major attempt to reclaim Messenian territories, launched in 369 BC under the leadership of King Agesilaus, demonstrated how severely territorial losses had compromised traditional Spartan military capabilities. The expedition that marched northward from Laconia included fewer than 800 Spartiates supported by approximately 3,000 Piraeotian allied troops, a force that represented less than one-third the size of armies that Sparta had routinely fielded during the 5th century. The bronze-tipped spears that these warriors carried, their wooden shafts showing the pale colour of freshly cut timber, revealed the hasty armament production that had been necessary to equip even this reduced force. The encounter with Messenian defenders at the Steni Claras plain revealed how thoroughly the balance of military power had shifted in favour of the formerly enslaved population. The Messenian phalanx that advanced to meet Spartan forces included over 4,000 heavy infantry, equipped with bronze armour and iron weapons that matched or exceeded the quality of Lacedaemonian equipment. The sight of former helots standing in disciplined formation, their bronze-faced shields bearing the distinctive Messenian symbols while their iron spearheads glinted in perfect alignment, provided visual confirmation that social liberation had generated military capabilities that traditional Spartan advantages could no longer overcome. The tactical engagement itself lasted less than 2 hours, with Spartan forces withdrawing after suffering casualties that they could not afford to sustain in prolonged combat. The death of approximately 150 Spartiates during this brief encounter eliminated more than 10% of the remaining citizen military class, while the psychological impact of retreat before former slaves shattered confidence in traditional military superiority. The sight of Lacedaemonian warriors limping southward, with their bronze armour dented and their scarlet cloaks torn, while Messenian cavalry harassed their withdrawal, demonstrated the complete reversal of power relationships that territorial liberation had achieved. The economic consequences of this military failure extended beyond immediate campaign costs to encompass fundamental questions about the sustainability of Spartan social organisation. The citizen families whose estates had been ravaged during the Messenian campaign faced reduced agricultural production during a period when increased output had become essential for maintaining basic living standards. The olive groves that lined the Eurotas Valley showed obvious signs of neglect as Helot labourers were diverted to military support duties, while grain fields displayed the patchy cultivation patterns that characterised insufficient workforce allocation. The monetary costs of maintaining military readiness under these constrained circumstances forced unprecedented changes in traditional Spartan economic practices. The ephors authorised the first systematic taxation of citizen property in Lacedaemonian history, their bronze tablets recording assessments that violated fundamental principles regarding the relationship between citizenship and economic obligation. The sight of Spartan officials measuring agricultural estates and calculating tribute requirements, their bronze measuring rods marking boundaries while scribes recorded production quotas, represented institutional adaptations that acknowledged the inadequacy of traditional resource mobilization methods. The second expedition against Messenia, organized during 368 BC with Persian financial assistance, revealed how thoroughly Spartan strategic independence had been compromised by economic necessity. The subsidies provided by satrap Ariobarzanes enabled the recruitment of mercenary forces that supplemented the depleted citizen levy, yet these foreign troops required payment in silver currency that strained Spartan treasury resources. The sight of Thracian peltasts and Cretan archers assembling in Laconian training camps, their exotic weapons and unfamiliar languages creating obvious contrasts with traditional military culture, illustrated the extent to which external dependence had replaced self-sufficient military organisation. The mercenary contingents that accompanied this second expedition displayed equipment quality that exceeded what most Spartiates could afford to maintain through personal resources. The Thracian light infantry carried bronze-tipped javelins with perfectly balanced wooden shafts, while their leather armour featured metal reinforcements that provided superior protection compared to the patched gear that characterised much Spartan equipment. The Cretan archers bore composite bows crafted from horn and sinew that could penetrate bronze armour at ranges that exceeded traditional hoplite engagement distances, their quivers filled with iron-pointed arrows whose consistent manufacture revealed professional military supply systems. The campaign itself achieved limited territorial gains that proved impossible to maintain against sustained Messenian resistance. The capture of several border fortifications required siege operations that consumed enormous quantities of supplies, while exposing Spartan forces to casualty rates that their reduced population could not sustain. The sight of bronze-headed battering rams being hauled against stone walls, while defenders rained arrows and stones from above, their iron points finding gaps in Spartan armour, despite the protection of bronze-faced shields, demonstrated how siege warfare had become prohibitively expensive for a state with limited human resources. The withdrawal from these temporary conquests during late 368 BC marked the effective end of Spartan attempts to restore territorial control through military action. The fortifications that had been captured at such enormous cost were systematically demolished before abandonment, their massive stone blocks scattered across the landscape, while bronze fittings were removed for transport back to Laconia. The sight of these ruined walls, their limestone foundations cracked and their defensive towers reduced to rubble, provided permanent reminders of Spartan military limitations, while serving as monuments to Messenian determination to maintain independence. The demographic crisis that these failed campaigns created within the Spartiate class reached critical proportions by 367 BC, when census records revealed that fewer than 1,000 adult male citizens remained capable of military service. The age structure of this remnant population showed dangerous imbalances, with elderly men comprising over 40% of the total, while young adults represented less than 20%. The sight of greying veterans struggling to maintain formation drill in the traditional training grounds, Their movement slowed by age while gaps in their ranks revealed the absence of younger replacements, illustrated the approaching extinction of the citizen class that had once dominated Greek military affairs. The Helot population in remaining Laconian territories began to exhibit increasing signs of unrest, as their reduced numbers faced intensified labour demands without corresponding improvements in living conditions. The agricultural estates that had once supported comfortable Spartiate lifestyles now required maximum production to maintain even basic subsistence levels, while the reduced citizen presence eliminated much of the supervision that had previously prevented organised resistance. The sight of Helot families working exhausted fields under the supervision of ageing Spartiates, their bronze tools breaking from overuse while their masters lacked the resources to provide adequate replacements, revealed the unsustainable nature of the social system that territorial losses had created. The religious festivals that had traditionally reinforced social cohesion through shared celebrations began to reflect the economic and demographic decline that characterized Spartan society. The Carnia festival of 366 BC displayed obvious reductions in the scale and quality of traditional observances, with fewer sacrificial animals and simpler ceremonial equipment marking the constraints that limited even religious expenditures. The processions that wound through Sparta's streets included noticeably fewer participants, their bronze ceremonial weapons and embroidered garments showing signs of wear that reflected the inability to maintain traditional standards of religious display. The international isolation that accompanied military failure and economic decline manifested in the gradual withdrawal of foreign diplomatic representation from Sparta. The ambassadors who had once competed for Lacedaemonian attention now directed their efforts toward Thebes and other rising powers, while their former residences in Sparta stood empty with bronze door fittings tarnished from neglect. The sight of these abandoned diplomatic compounds, their courtyards overgrown with weeds while their reception halls gathered dust, symbolized the complete transformation of Sparta's international status from regional hegemon to isolated and declining city-state. The trade relationships that had previously connected Sparta to broader Mediterranean commercial networks also showed systematic deterioration as economic decline reduced both demand for imports and capacity to provide valuable exports. The port facilities at Gythium, which had once bustled with merchant vessels carrying goods throughout the Greek world, now accommodated only occasional coastal traders, whose small bronze-fitted ships reflected the reduced scale of commercial activity. The sight of empty harbour berths where massive grain ships had once unloaded their cargoes, their stone quays cracked from neglect while bronze mooring rings rusted in the salt air, illustrated how thoroughly economic collapse had severed Sparta's connections to the prosperity that had characterized the classical period. The bronze mooring rings that rusted in Gythium's abandoned harbour bore silent witness to more than commercial decline. They marked the end of an era in which Spartan society had possessed the economic foundation necessary to sustain its traditional institutions. By 244 BC, when the 20-year-old Agiai's IV ascended to the Eurypontid throne, the demographic catastrophe that had begun with territorial losses in the 4th century had reached a terminal phase. The citizen body that had once numbered over 8,000 adult males now comprised fewer than 700 Spartiates, their bronze-fitted estates worked by a Helot population that had itself declined to perhaps 15,000 individuals scattered across the remaining territories of Laconia. The young king who emerged from this devastated social landscape possessed both the idealistic vision and aristocratic credentials necessary to attempt comprehensive reform, yet his proposals would reveal the fundamental contradictions that made systematic change impossible within existing institutional frameworks. Agiai's IV's physical appearance reflected the traditional Spartan ideal, tall and lean, with the distinctive scars that marked graduates of an agoge system that still functioned despite reduced numbers, his bronze-coloured hair worn in the ancient style that connected him to legendary kings of the heroic age. Yet his intellectual formation had occurred during decades of decline that exposed the inadequacies of traditional solutions to unprecedented problems. The economic analysis that informed Aegis's reform proposals demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the mathematical relationships between population, productivity, and military capability that had been obscured by centuries of institutional conservatism. The royal advisors who compiled statistical evidence for the king's consideration revealed that the average Spartiate estate now encompassed over 400 hectares of agricultural land, compared to the traditional allotment of approximately 18 hectares that had sustained citizen equality during the classical period. This massive concentration of property ownership meant that fewer than 100 families controlled roughly 60% of all productive land in Laconia, while the remaining citizens struggled to maintain the economic foundation necessary for mess participation and military service. The debt crisis that had emerged from this economic inequality created a vicious cycle that systematically eliminated citizens from active participation in traditional institutions. The poorer Spartiates, unable to maintain their required contributions to the common meals, faced automatic exclusion from citizenship despite their birth status and military training. The bronze tokens that had once marked mess membership now lay unused in family treasuries, their oxidized surfaces serving as reminders of social positions that economic hardship had made impossible to maintain. The sight of former citizens working their reduced holdings with their own hands, their bronze agricultural tools reflecting the absence of helot labour they could no longer afford to maintain, illustrated the breakdown of fundamental social distinctions. The land redistribution proposal that formed the centrepiece of Aegis's reform programme called for the division of all Laconian territory into 4,500 equal lots, with 15,000 perioei receiving smaller allotments that would provide economic foundation for military service as light armed troops. This mathematical precision reflected careful calculation of the population levels necessary to restore effective military capability, while the inclusion of perioeci in land ownership represented a radical departure from traditional social hierarchy. The bronze surveying instruments that royal officials used to map existing property boundaries reveal the enormous complexity of implementing such comprehensive redistribution, as centuries of inheritance and sale had created overlapping claims that defied easy resolution. The debt cancellation component of the reform package addressed the financial obligations that had reduced many Spartiates to virtual serfdom, despite their theoretical citizenship status. The wooden tablets that recorded these debts, stored in private strongboxes throughout Sparta, represented claims totaling over 1,200 talents of silver, an amount that exceeded the annual productive capacity of all remaining Spartan territories. The sight of these debt records being examined by royal commissioners, their bronze styluses scratching calculations, while scribes recorded the complex web of obligations that bound citizen families to wealthy creditors, demonstrated how thoroughly traditional economic relationships had been corrupted by monetary practices alien to ancient Spartan culture. The opposition that emerged against these proposals reflected not merely conservative resistance to change, but fundamental conflicts between different visions of Spartan identity and purpose. The wealthy Spartiates, who controlled the largest estates, argued that property redistribution would destroy the economic foundation that maintained their families' ability to provide military leadership and civic service. Their bronze-fitted houses, decorated with imported marble and furnished with luxury items that violated traditional sumptuary laws, represented the lifestyle standards that they refused to abandon in favour of ancient equality. The sight of these aristocratic residences, their courtyards filled with bronze statuary while their storage rooms contained amphorae of imported wine, provided visual evidence of the social transformation that had occurred during centuries of imperial expansion and subsequent decline. The Ephorate, dominated by representatives of these wealthy families, possessed constitutional authority to block royal initiatives that threatened established property relationships. The 5 ephors who held office during 244 BC included 3 men whose personal estates would face significant reduction under the proposed redistribution, while their families' debt holdings represented substantial portions of their total wealth. The bronze chairs in which these officials conducted their deliberations had been purchased with profits derived from the very economic arrangements that royal reform threatened to eliminate, creating obvious conflicts of interest that made impartial consideration of the proposals impossible. The Gerousia presented an even more formidable obstacle to reform implementation, as its members represented the oldest and most conservative elements within Spartan society. The 28 senators who sat alongside the 2 kings included men whose families had accumulated vast estates through generations of careful marriage alliances and property acquisitions. Their bronze walking sticks, crafted from precious metals and decorated with ancestral symbols, reflected the traditional authority that they claimed to defend against radical innovation. The sight of these elderly men gathering in the ancient council chamber, their white hair and weathered faces marking decades of service to traditional institutions, provided powerful symbolic opposition to proposals that challenged fundamental assumptions about property and citizenship. The co-king Leonidas II emerged as the most effective opponent of Agis' reform program, using his constitutional position and family connections to organize systematic resistance among conservative elements throughout Spartan society. Leonidas' own background included extensive property holdings and debt investments that would suffer substantial losses under the proposed redistribution, while his marriage connections linked him to the wealthiest families whose interests the reforms threatened most directly. The sight of this rival king moving through Sparta's streets, his purple-bordered cloak marking royal status, while his bronze-fitted retinue included representatives of every major conservative family, demonstrated the institutional resources that could be mobilized against radical change. The constitutional crisis that developed during 243 BC revealed how thoroughly traditional governmental structures had been compromised by the economic interests they were supposed to regulate impartially. The ephors' refusal to submit the reform proposals to the citizen assembly for consideration violated fundamental principles of Spartan governance, while their attempts to prosecute AGIs for unconstitutional behaviour ignored the precedents that had allowed previous kings to initiate major policy changes. The bronze tablets that recorded these legal proceedings, their inscriptions reflecting the complex constitutional arguments that both sides advanced, illustrated how institutional mechanisms designed to maintain stability had become instruments for preserving inequality. The popular support that Agis' proposals generated among the remaining citizen population demonstrated the widespread recognition that traditional institutions had failed to address the demographic and economic crises that threatened Spartan survival. The assemblies that gathered in the ancient meeting place included citizens whose bronze-fitted armour showed obvious signs of repair and reuse, while their weathered faces reflected the hardships that economic decline had imposed on families that had once enjoyed comfortable prosperity. The sight of these men raising their hands to vote for radical reform, their bronze bracelets catching the morning sunlight while their voices echoed across the stone seats, provided evidence that desperation had overcome traditional conservatism among substantial portions of the population. The younger generation of Spartiates proved particularly receptive to reform proposals that offered hope for restoring the military glory and social cohesion that their education had taught them to value above personal wealth. These men, trained in traditional military skills but unable to afford the equipment and lifestyle necessary for effective service, saw land redistribution as the only viable path toward fulfilling their cultural obligations as citizen soldiers. The bronze spearheads that they carried during training exercises showed the rough finish that characterized hasty production under resource constraints, while their leather armor displayed the patched appearance that marked economic hardship rather than martial preference. The religious justification that AGI's advanced for his reform program drew on ancient traditions that connected land ownership to divine mandate and social justice. The king's advisors cited oracular pronouncements and historical precedents that supported the principle of equal land distribution, while their bronze ritual implements reflected the ceremonial authority that legitimized royal initiatives in religious matters. The sight of these sacred objects being displayed during public ceremonies, their polished surfaces reflecting torchlight, while incense smoke rose from bronze braziers, provided spiritual validation for proposals that conservative opponents characterized as violations of ancestral custom. The tactical implementation of the reform measures began with Aegis's attempt to secure ephorial support through the election of sympathetic candidates during 243 BC. The campaign that preceded this election included unprecedented public advocacy for specific policy positions, as candidates openly declared their intentions regarding land redistribution and debt cancellation. The bronze voting tokens that citizens cast in the traditional urns reflected careful calculation of personal interests against broader social concerns, while the counting procedures revealed the narrow margins that separated reformist and conservative factions within the reduced citizen body. The temporary success of this electoral strategy, which placed 3 reform supporters among the 5 ephors, created the constitutional majority necessary to advance legislative proposals despite continued opposition from the Charosia and co-king Leonidas. The bronze seals that marked official ephemeral decisions now bore the authority of men committed to systematic social transformation, while their daily proclamations announced policy changes that challenged fundamental assumptions about property rights and citizenship obligations. The sight of these new officials conducting business in the traditional ephorate building, their bronze-fitted furniture unchanged despite their revolutionary agenda, illustrated the institutional continuity that masked radical policy departures. The debt cancellation decree that the reformed ephorate issued during late 243 BC eliminated financial obligations totaling over 800 talents, freeing hundreds of citizen families from economic bondage that had prevented their participation in traditional institutions. The ceremonial burning of debt records in the agora created a spectacular display that symbolized liberation from financial oppression, as wooden tablets and bronze-reinforced contracts were consumed in flames that reached toward the sky, while crowds of citizens cheered their deliverance. The sight of these documents being reduced to ash, their bronze fittings melting in the intense heat, while smoke carried away the legal instruments of economic inequality, provided powerful validation of royal authority to override established property relationships. The immediate consequences of debt cancellation included the restoration of citizenship rights for approximately 200 Spartiates who had been excluded from mess participation due to financial inability. These men returned to the common meals with obvious relief and gratitude, their bronze mess tokens polished to gleaming brightness, while their conversations revealed the psychological burden that economic exclusion had imposed on families trained from childhood to value civic participation above personal comfort. The sight of formerly excluded citizens taking their places at traditional dining tables, their bronze cups filled with the simple wine that marked Spartan equality, demonstrated the social healing that financial reform could accomplish within existing institutional frameworks. The land redistribution proposal faced more complex implementation challenges that revealed the practical difficulties of transforming theoretical equality into actual economic arrangements. The surveying work that began during early 242 BC required detailed mapping of property boundaries that had been established through centuries of inheritance, purchase, and legal settlement. The bronze instruments that royal commissioners used for this massive undertaking included measuring chains, angle calculating devices, and boundary markers whose precise placement would determine the economic foundation of Spartan society for generations to come. The resistance that wealthy landowners organised against actual property redistribution proved far more effective than their previous constitutional opposition, as they possessed resources and connections that extended beyond Spartan territory to encompass foreign allies and mercenary forces. The bronze-fitted strong boxes that contained their portable wealth could be transferred to secure locations outside Laconia, while their family connections provided refuge in other Greek cities where traditional property rights received greater protection. The sight of ox-drawn carts loaded with household goods and precious objects leaving Sparta during the spring of 242 BC, their bronze fittings glinting in the morning sun, while armed guards ensured safe passage, illustrated the capital flight that threatened to eliminate the economic resources necessary for successful reform implementation. The constitutional counter-revolution that developed during 242 BC exploited the institutional mechanisms that AGIs had used to advance his reform program, as conservative forces organised their own electoral campaign to regain control of the ephorate. The bronze tokens that had validated reformist victories now became instruments for conservative restoration, while the voting procedures that had enabled change provided opportunities for its reversal. The sight of wealthy citizens distributing gifts and promises to influence electoral outcomes, their bronze-fitted servants carrying amphorae of wine and baskets of food to potential supporters, demonstrated how thoroughly traditional political culture had been corrupted by economic inequality. The judicial proceedings that followed the conservative electoral victory in 241 BC marked an unprecedented violation of traditional protections for royal authority and constitutional governance. The ephors who now controlled Spartan legal processes initiated prosecution of AGIs for treason, citing his attempts to redistribute property and cancel debts as violations of ancestral law and divine mandate. The bronze tablets that recorded these charges reflected legal arguments that had never been applied to royal behaviour in previous centuries, while their constitutional interpretations created precedents that fundamentally altered the balance of power within Spartan governmental institutions. The execution of AGI's IV, carried out in late 241 BC after a trial that violated every principle of traditional Spartan justice, represented the complete breakdown of institutional restraints that had maintained political stability for over 6 centuries. The sight of the young king being led to his death, his royal purple torn away while bronze shackles marked his transformation from sovereign ruler to condemned criminal, provided shocking evidence that conservative desperation had overcome the most fundamental taboos of Spartan political culture. The bronze-tipped spears that surrounded his final moments belonged to guards whose loyalty had been purchased with promises of property and position, while their faces reflected the shame that accompanied participation in regicide. The broader implications of this unprecedented execution extended far beyond the immediate elimination of a reformist king to encompass fundamental questions about the viability of traditional institutions under conditions of extreme social and economic stress. The constitutional mechanisms that had enabled Aegis's rise to power had also facilitated his destruction, while the legal procedures that legitimize royal authority proved inadequate to protect it against organised opposition. The bronze crown that had marked Eurypontid kingship now passed to successors who understood that royal power depended on conservative support rather than popular mandate or constitutional prerogative. The demographic consequences of the failed reform attempt included not merely the loss of the king himself, but the elimination or exile of dozens of reform supporters whose participation had marked them for conservative retaliation. The citizen body, already reduced to fewer than 700 adult males, lost additional members whose absence further weakened the social foundation necessary for military effectiveness and civic governance. The bronze memorial tablets that recorded these losses, their inscriptions marking the end of family lines that had contributed to Spartan society for generations, illustrated how political conflict had accelerated the demographic decline that reform had been intended to address. The economic disruption that accompanied the constitutional crisis eliminated many of the modest gains that debt cancellation had achieved for struggling citizen families. The restoration of financial obligations, combined with the property confiscations that punished reform supporters, recreated the conditions of economic inequality that had motivated the original reform proposals. The bronze scales that measured restored debts showed increases that reflected penalty charges and accumulated interest, while their calculations revealed how thoroughly conservative victory had reversed the temporary liberation that debt cancellation had provided. The international implications of Aegis's execution resonated throughout the Hellenistic world as evidence that traditional Greek institutions had lost the flexibility necessary to adapt to changing circumstances. The bronze-sealed diplomatic correspondence that reached foreign courts described Spartan political developments with a mixture of shock and calculation as potential allies and enemies assessed the implications of institutional breakdown within a state that had once dominated Greek military affairs. The sight of foreign ambassadors departing from Sparta after delivering formal condolences for the king's death, their bronze-fitted carriages carrying reports that would influence international policy for decades to come, demonstrated how thoroughly domestic political failure had compromised Spartan credibility in broader Mediterranean affairs. The bronze-fitted carriages carrying reports of Aegi's IV's execution had barely disappeared beyond the borders of Laconia when another member of the Aegeid royal house began plotting a far more systematic approach to Spartan revival. Cleomenes III, who assumed the throne in 235 BC at the age of 25, possessed both the tactical acumen and political ruthlessness that his predecessor had lacked. Unlike the idealistic Aegi's, whose reform proposals had been undermined by constitutional opposition and personal naivety, Cleomenes understood that fundamental change required the elimination of institutional obstacles through decisive military action rather than patient negotiation with entrenched conservative interests. The new king's physical presence commanded immediate respect from the depleted citizen body that had witnessed the humiliation and death of his reformist predecessor. Standing over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and scarred hands that marked intensive military training, Cleomenes moved through Sparta's streets with the confident bearing of a professional soldier rather than a ceremonial monarch. His bronze-fitted armour, worn during daily training exercises rather than reserved for formal occasions, displayed the functional design that prioritised battlefield effectiveness over decorative display. The sight of this imposing figure conducting weapons practice in the traditional training grounds, his bronze-tipped spear cutting precise arcs through the morning air, while his movements demonstrated perfect technical execution, provided visual reassurance that royal leadership had returned to competent hands. The strategic analysis that informed Cleomenes' approach to reform reflected sophisticated understanding of the military and political dynamics that had destroyed previous attempts at social transformation. The king's advisors, selected for their practical experience rather than aristocratic connections, compiled detailed intelligence regarding the factional alignments that controlled Spartan governmental institutions. Their bronze-sealed reports identified specific individuals whose elimination would remove the most effective opposition to radical change, while their tactical assessments evaluated the military resources necessary to overcome armed resistance from conservative elements. The sight of these officials meeting in secure locations throughout Sparta their bronze writing tablets concealed beneath travelling cloaks, while their conversations remained deliberately vague to casual observers, illustrated the conspiratorial atmosphere that surrounded preparation for revolutionary action. The ephorate that had orchestrated Aegis's execution remained dominated by representatives of the wealthiest families whose property interests had motivated their opposition to land redistribution and debt cancellation. The 5 officials who controlled Spartan legal and administrative functions during 235 BC included men whose personal fortunes exceeded the combined wealth of hundreds of ordinary citizens, while their family connections encompassed every major conservative faction within the reduced social structure. Their bronze-fitted offices in the traditional ephorate building had been redecorated with imported luxury items that violated ancient sumptuary laws, while their daily routines included elaborate meals and entertainment that contrasted sharply with the austere lifestyle that traditional Spartan culture demanded from public officials. The mercenary forces that Cleomenes began recruiting during 234 BC provided the military foundation necessary to overcome domestic opposition while pursuing territorial expansion that could restore Spartan economic viability. These professional soldiers, drawn primarily from Crete and the Aegean Islands, possessed combat experience and equipment quality that exceeded the capabilities of most contemporary Greek citizen militias. Their bronze-reinforced leather armour reflected the latest developments in protective technology, while their iron-tipped spears and bronze-faced shields displayed the standardized manufacture that characterized professional military supply systems. The sight of these foreign warriors training in Laconian camps, their exotic accents mixing with shouted commands while their disciplined formations wheeled across dusty parade grounds, demonstrated the transformation of Spartan military culture from citizen-based service to professional mercenary employment. The financial resources necessary to maintain these mercenary contingents came from carefully planned raids against wealthy Perioeci communities, whose accumulated prosperity had survived the general economic decline that characterized the region. The bronze-fitted strongboxes that Cleomenes' agents seized during these operations contained silver coins, precious metals, and valuable trade goods that provided immediate funding for military expansion while eliminating potential sources of support for conservative opposition. The sight of ox-drawn carts loaded with confiscated wealth arriving at royal storage facilities, their bronze-reinforced wheels creaking under the weight of accumulated treasure while armed guards ensured secure transport, illustrated the systematic resource extraction that supported the king's strategic preparations. The coup that eliminated the ephorate as an independent political force occurred during the night of September 15th, 227 BC, when Cleomenes' mercenary troops surrounded the traditional government buildings, while citizen loyalists secured key positions throughout the city. The operation began at midnight with coordinated attacks on the residences of all 5 ephors, whose bronze-fitted doors were smashed open by armed men whose faces remained concealed behind bronze-reinforced helmets. The sight of these officials being dragged from their beds, their silk sleeping garments torn while bronze shackles marked their transformation from rulers to prisoners, provided dramatic evidence that traditional constitutional protections had been swept away by revolutionary violence. The execution of 4 ephors, carried out at dawn in the central agora, before crowds of citizens whose attendance had been mandated by royal decree, demonstrated Cleomenes' determination to eliminate opposition through methods that his predecessor had been unwilling or unable to employ. The bronze-headed axes that severed the necks of these former officials reflected the king's decision to abandon traditional Spartan reluctance regarding capital punishment in favour of decisive action against institutional enemies. The sight of these severed heads being displayed on bronze-tipped spikes around the agora's perimeter, their lifeless eyes staring across the stone pavement while blood stained the ancient meeting place, where generations of citizens had conducted peaceful deliberations, marked the complete breakdown of constitutional governance in favour of royal autocracy. The Gerousia faced systematic purging during the following weeks as Cleomenes identified senators whose family connections or property interests aligned them with conservative opposition to reform. The bronze chairs that had seated 28 elderly councillors for centuries now accommodated fewer than 15 men whose loyalty to the new regime had been demonstrated through active support for revolutionary change. The sight of empty seats in the ancient council chamber, their bronze fittings tarnished from neglect while dust accumulated on cushions that would never again support their former occupants, illustrated the demographic and political transformation that royal violence had imposed on traditional institutions. The land redistribution that followed this constitutional revolution proceeded with mathematical precision that reflected careful planning rather than spontaneous social upheaval. The royal commissioners who supervised property division carried bronze-sealed documents that specified the exact boundaries and productive capacity of each new allotment, while their surveying instruments enabled precise measurement of territories that would support specific numbers of citizen families. The sight of these officials moving across the Laconian countryside, their bronze measuring chains glinting in the afternoon sunlight, while scribes recorded detailed descriptions of soil quality and water access, demonstrated the systematic approach that distinguished Cleomenes' reforms from the theoretical proposals that had characterized previous attempts at social change. The 4,000 perioeci who received citizenship and land grants under the new system represented the most dramatic expansion of the Spartan citizen body since the Archaic period. These former second-class residents, whose families had provided military service and technical expertise for generations without political recognition, now found themselves elevated to full participation in governmental institutions and military leadership. Their bronze citizenship tokens, distributed during elaborate ceremonies that emphasized the revolutionary nature of their new status, reflected the king's determination to create a broader social foundation for military effectiveness and political loyalty. The sight of former perioeci taking their places in the citizen assembly, their bronze voting tokens catching the morning light, while their weathered faces showed obvious pride in their elevated status, illustrated the social transformation that constitutional revolution had made possible. The military training program that Cleomenes implemented for his expanded citizen body combined traditional Spartan discipline with tactical innovations that reflected contemporary developments in Hellenistic warfare. The new citizens received intensive instruction in phalanx combat, individual weapons handling, and small unit tactics that prepared them for both conventional hoplite engagements and the more flexible operations that characterized modern military campaigns. Their bronze-tipped spears, manufactured according to standardized specifications that ensured uniform length and weight, enabled coordinated formations that could match the precision of traditional Spartan phalanxes while incorporating larger numbers of motivated participants. The economic foundation that supported this military expansion rested on the confiscated estates of executed or exiled conservative opponents, whose accumulated wealth provided both immediate funding and long-term agricultural productivity. The royal administrators who managed these properties implemented intensive cultivation methods that maximised output while maintaining the soil quality necessary for sustainable production. Their bronze agricultural implements, distributed to helot workers whose labour obligations had been modified to encourage increased productivity, reflected the technological improvements that systematic management could achieve when traditional aristocratic inefficiency was eliminated through revolutionary change. The helot population that remained under Spartan control experienced significant improvements in living conditions, as Cleomenes recognized that agricultural productivity depended on worker motivation rather than mere coercion. The new regulations that governed helot labour included provisions for personal property ownership, family stability, and limited legal protections that had never existed under traditional arrangements. The sight of Helot families constructing improved housing with bronze-fitted tools and ceramic roof tiles, their children playing freely in village squares while their parents worked fields that would provide both subsistence and modest surplus for their own use, demonstrated the social progress that enlightened labour policy could achieve even within fundamentally exploitative relationships. The territorial expansion that began in 226 BC targeted the Arcadian communities that had previously allied themselves with Spartan enemies, while accumulating wealth that could support Cleomenes' military objectives. The campaign against Megalopolis revealed the effectiveness of the reformed Spartan military system. As the expanded citizen phalanx advanced across the Arcadian plain with mechanical precision that recalled the legendary discipline of classical Lacedaemonian armies. The bronze-faced shields that reflected morning sunlight along the advancing formation created a wall of gleaming metal that stretched across nearly a kilometre of front, while the iron spearheads that projected from perfectly aligned ranks provided visual confirmation that Spartan military capability had been restored through systematic reform. The siege operations that reduced Megalopolis to submission demonstrated Cleomenes' mastery of contemporary military technology and his willingness to employ methods that traditional Spartan warfare had typically avoided. The bronze-headed battering rams that his engineers constructed incorporated design improvements that enabled more effective assault against modern fortification systems, while their siege towers provided elevated platforms for archers and javelin throwers whose missiles could reach defenders on the highest ramparts. The sight of these massive wooden structures being wheeled against stone walls, their bronze fittings gleaming while their crews operated under protective screens of bronze-reinforced leather, illustrated the technological sophistication that supported Spartan military revival. The capture of Megalopolis provided both symbolic vindication of Spartan resurgence and practical resources that enabled further territorial expansion. The wealth that Cleomenes' forces seized from this prosperous commercial centre included over 300 talents of silver, substantial quantities of bronze and iron weapons, and agricultural supplies that could sustain military operations for extended periods. The sight of captured treasure being loaded onto ox-drawn carts for transport to Laconia, their bronze-reinforced wheels creaking under the weight of accumulated wealth, while armed guards ensured secure passage, demonstrated the material benefits that successful military expansion could provide for a reformed social system. The psychological impact of this victory resonated throughout the Peloponnese as evidence that Spartan military effectiveness had been restored through internal reform and external aggression. The bronze trophies that Cleomenes erected on the battlefield, decorated with captured Arcadian weapons and armour, served as permanent reminders that Lacedaemonian power could once again challenge the political arrangements that had constrained Spartan influence since the 4th century defeats. The sight of these monuments, their polished bronze surfaces reflecting sunlight across the conquered territory, while inscriptions proclaimed Spartan victory in classical Greek verse, provided visual confirmation that traditional military glory had returned to support revolutionary social change. The Achaean League's response to Spartan resurgence reflected the broader regional concern that Cleomenes' success might inspire similar revolutionary movements throughout the Peloponnese. The League Assembly that convened at Aegaeum during late 226 BC included representatives from communities whose own social stability depended on maintaining the conservative political arrangements that Spartan reform threatened to undermine. Their bronze-sealed resolutions called for coordinated military action against Cleomenes, while their diplomatic correspondence sought external assistance from powers whose interests aligned with containing Spartan territorial expansion. The military forces that the Achaean League assembled for confrontation with reformed Sparta included approximately 15,000 citizen soldiers whose equipment and training reflected the citizen militia tradition that had replaced professional military service in most Greek communities during the Hellenistic period. Their bronze armour showed the variations in quality and design that characterised local production rather than standardised military supply systems, while their iron weapons displayed the functional simplicity that prioritised cost efficiency over battlefield effectiveness. The sight of these diverse contingents assembling at designated concentration points, their different shield devices and uniform styles, creating a patchwork appearance that contrasted with Spartan standardization, illustrated the organizational challenges that faced coalition warfare against a unified enemy. The initial engagements between Spartan and Achaean forces during 225 BC demonstrated the tactical advantages that Cleomenes' military reforms had achieved through systematic training and equipment standardization. The battle near Dyme resulted in decisive Spartan victory as the reformed phalanx broke through Achaean lines with coordinated precision that overwhelmed citizen militia resistance. The sight of Achaean warriors fleeing across the coastal plain, their bronze armour abandoned while their iron weapons littered the battlefield, provided evidence that professional military organisation could overcome numerical superiority when properly applied against less disciplined opposition. The territorial gains that followed these tactical successes included control over several major Achaean cities whose wealth and strategic position enhanced Spartan capabilities for sustained military operations. The tribute that Cleomenes imposed on these conquered communities generated revenue streams that supported continued mercenary recruitment, while providing resources for infrastructure improvements within Laconia itself. The bronze-fitted administrative buildings that Spartan governors established in occupied territories reflected the systematic approach to imperial administration that distinguished Cleomenes' expansion from previous Spartan territorial acquisitions. The diplomatic revolution that Spartan success created throughout the Greek world manifested in the growing recognition that traditional political arrangements could no longer contain the social forces that Cleomenes' example had unleashed. The bronze-sealed correspondence that reached foreign courts described Spartan military achievements with mixture of admiration and alarm, as potential allies and enemies calculated the implications of revolutionary success for their own internal stability. The sight of diplomatic missions departing from various Greek cities, their bronze-fitted carriages loaded with gifts and proposals while their occupants carried instructions that reflected careful assessment of changing power relationships, demonstrated how thoroughly Spartan resurgence had disrupted established international alignments. The Macedonian intervention that ultimately destroyed Cleomenes' achievements began with King Antigonus Doson's recognition that Spartan success threatened the broader Hellenistic political system that supported Macedonian hegemony throughout Greece. The subsidies that Antigonus provided to the Achaean League enabled the recruitment of professional mercenary forces whose capabilities could match Spartan military effectiveness, while his diplomatic pressure secured additional allies whose combined resources exceeded what reformed Sparta could sustain in prolonged warfare. The sight of Macedonian silver being distributed to coalition partners, the coins bearing royal portraits while their weight and purity guaranteed payment for military service, illustrated the financial resources that major Hellenistic powers could deploy to contain regional threats to their authority. The Battle of Silesia, fought on July 22nd, 222 BC, represented the final test of whether revolutionary social reform could generate sufficient military capability to overcome the combined opposition of traditional conservative forces supported by foreign intervention. The Spartan position on the hills overlooking the Eurotas Valley provided defensive advantages that Cleomenes hoped would compensate for his numerical inferiority against the coalition forces that Antigonus had assembled. The bronze-tipped stakes that Spartan engineers drove into the hillside created obstacles designed to disrupt enemy cavalry charges, while their field fortifications incorporated stone walls that could shelter infantry during missile exchanges with superior numbers of enemy archers and slingers. The deployment that Cleomenes adopted for this decisive engagement concentrated his most reliable troops, including the reformed citizen phalanx and veteran mercenary contingents, on the central heights where their bronze-faced shields created an unbroken wall of metal that reflected the morning sunlight across the valley below. The sight of these disciplined formations maintaining perfect alignment, despite the irregular terrain, the iron spearheads projecting in serried ranks while their scarlet cloaks marked traditional Spartan identity, provided final evidence that military excellence could survive social revolution when properly organised and systematically maintained. The Macedonian assault that began at dawn demonstrated the tactical sophistication that professional military leadership could achieve when supported by adequate resources and experienced troops. The phalanx formations that advanced up the hillside included veterans of numerous campaigns whose bronze armour bore the dents and repairs that marked extensive battlefield experience, while their coordinated movements reflected training standards that exceeded even reformed Spartan capabilities. The sight of these massive formations climbing towards Spartan positions, their bronze-tipped sarissæ creating a forest of spear points that extended far beyond traditional hoplite reach, illustrated the technological and organisational advantages that major powers could deploy against smaller states regardless of their internal military excellence. The collapse of Spartan resistance occurred when simultaneous pressure from multiple directions overwhelmed the defensive advantages that terrain and fortification had provided. The death of approximately 6,000 Spartan troops, including most of the reformed citizen body and veteran mercenary units, eliminated the military foundation that had supported Cleomenes' revolutionary achievements. The sight of these warriors lying motionless on the blooded hillside, their bronze armour reflecting the afternoon sun, while their iron weapons remained clutched in hands that would never again serve Spartan military glory, marked the end of the last serious attempt to restore Lacedaemonian power through internal reform and external expansion. The sight of these warriors lying motionless on the bloodied hillside, their bronze armour reflecting the afternoon sun, while their iron weapons remained clutched in hands that would never again serve Spartan military glory, marked the end of the last serious attempt to restore Lacedaemonian power through internal reform and external expansion. The defeat at Silesia eliminated not merely an army but the entire social experiment that had briefly restored Spartan military capability through revolutionary change. Cleomenes III himself escaped the battlefield with a small retinue of survivors, yet his flight to Egypt represented the effective termination of independent Spartan policy and the beginning of a new phase in which external powers would determine the city's political arrangements according to their broader strategic interests. The Macedonian occupation that followed Antigonus Dosson's victory imposed governmental structures that eliminated the last vestiges of traditional Spartan institutions while integrating Laconia into the broader Hellenistic political system. The garrison troops that established themselves in key positions throughout Sparta included Macedonian phalangites, whose bronze armour and 18-foot sarissæ provided visual reminders of foreign domination, while their daily patrols through the city's streets demonstrated the military foundation that supported the new political arrangements. The bronze-fitted barracks that these soldiers constructed near the ancient agora replaced traditional Spartan training facilities with foreign military installations whose architectural style reflected Macedonian rather than Lacedaemonian cultural preferences. The constitutional changes that Antigonus implemented eliminated the dual kingship that had governed Spartan society for over 6 centuries, replacing royal authority with appointed magistrates whose loyalty to Macedonian interests took precedence over local concerns. The ephorate, which Cleomenes had abolished through revolutionary violence, remained suppressed under the new regime as Macedonian officials assumed direct control over judicial and administrative functions. The bronze seals that marked official documents now bore Macedonian royal symbols rather than traditional Spartan emblems, while the legal codes that governed daily life reflected foreign legal traditions that had no connection to ancestral Lacedaemonian customs. The territorial adjustments that accompanied political reorganisation eliminated Spartan control over the agricultural estates that had provided economic foundation for the reformed citizen body. The land redistribution that Cleomenes had implemented through systematic confiscation was reversed, as Macedonian administrators restored property to surviving conservative families whose loyalty to the new regime guaranteed their cooperation with foreign occupation. The bronze boundary markers that had defined the equal lots of reformed Spartan citizens were removed and replaced with stones bearing inscriptions that restored traditional property relationships, while the Helot population found itself once again subject to the exploitative labour arrangements that revolutionary reform had temporarily modified. The demographic catastrophe that Silesia had inflicted on the Spartan population created social conditions that made effective resistance to foreign domination impossible, even if political will had existed to organise such opposition. The citizen body that had briefly expanded to over 4,000 adult males under Cleomenes' reforms was reduced to fewer than 200 survivors, most of whom had suffered wounds that limited their capacity for military service. The bronze citizenship tokens that had marked the elevated status of former periouesi now lay scattered and abandoned throughout Laconia, the oxidized surfaces serving as reminders of social experiments that foreign intervention had terminated through decisive military action. The economic disruption that followed the restoration of conservative property arrangements eliminated the agricultural productivity gains that systematic land management had achieved during the revolutionary period. The intensive cultivation methods that royal administrators had implemented were abandoned as returning aristocratic landowners reverted to traditional extensive farming practices that prioritised social status over economic efficiency. The bronze agricultural implements that had equipped reformed farming operations were redistributed or sold to pay debts that the war and occupation had imposed on struggling landowners, while the Helot families that had experienced improved living conditions under Cleomenes found themselves subject to increased labour demands designed to compensate for reduced agricultural output. The cultural transformation that Macedonian occupation imposed on Spartan society manifested in the systematic elimination of traditional practices that had maintained Lacedaemonian identity for generations. The agoge system, which had continued to function despite reduced numbers throughout the period of decline, was formally abolished as Macedonian officials declared traditional Spartan education incompatible with peaceful integration into the Hellenistic world. The bronze training weapons that had equipped young Spartans for military service were confiscated and melted down for other purposes, while the barracks facilities where generations of warriors had learned discipline and loyalty were converted to housing for foreign administrators and their families. The religious institutions that had traditionally reinforced Spartan cultural identity faced systematic suppression as Macedonian authorities promoted foreign cults and practices that emphasized loyalty to Hellenistic rulers rather than local traditions. The festivals that had celebrated Spartan military achievements and social values were either eliminated entirely or modified to incorporate elements that glorified Macedonian power and cultural superiority. The bronze ritual implements that had served traditional ceremonies for centuries were confiscated and replaced with objects that reflected foreign religious practices, while the ancient shrines where Spartans had honoured their ancestors received new dedications that celebrated Macedonian victories over local resistance. The integration of surviving Spartans into broader Hellenistic society proceeded through mechanisms that eliminated distinctive cultural characteristics while rewarding adoption of foreign customs and values. The young men who had received traditional military training under the reformed agoge system found employment opportunities only through service in Macedonian military units, where their combat skills could be utilised under foreign command structures. Their bronze-fitted equipment was replaced with standardised Macedonian gear, whose design reflected different tactical doctrines and organisational principles, while their daily routines emphasised loyalty to Hellenistic monarchs rather than devotion to Spartan ideals. The commercial relationships that developed under Macedonian administration integrated Laconian agriculture into Mediterranean trade networks that had previously been disrupted by Spartan isolationism and military conflicts. The port facilities at Gythium received substantial investment that enabled the handling of larger merchant vessels, while their bronze-fitted warehouses stored goods destined for markets throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The sight of foreign traders conducting business in languages that few Spartans understood, their bronze-weighted scales measuring exotic products while their commercial contracts reflected legal traditions that bore no resemblance to traditional Lacedaemonian practices, illustrated the economic transformation that political integration had imposed on local society. The administrative efficiency that Macedonian governance achieved in Laconia demonstrated the advantages that professional bureaucratic management could provide compared to the traditional institutions that governed Spartan society for centuries. The tax collection systems that foreign officials implemented generated revenue streams that exceeded anything that previous Spartan governments had achieved, while their record-keeping procedures created detailed documentation of economic activities that enabled systematic planning and resource allocation. The bronze-sealed documents that recorded these administrative achievements reflected organisational capabilities that traditional Spartan institutions had never developed despite their military effectiveness and social cohesion. The population movements that occurred during the early decades of Macedonian rule included both voluntary emigration by Spartans seeking opportunities elsewhere, and systematic relocation of foreign settlers whose presence would ensure continued loyalty to the new regime. The families that departed Laconia carried their portable possessions in bronze-fitted chests, whose contents represented the accumulated wealth of generations, while their destinations included cities throughout the Mediterranean where Spartan military reputation still commanded respect despite political defeat. The sight of these refugees loading their belongings onto ships at Gythium, their weathered faces showing the resignation that accompanied permanent exile, while their children asked questions about homelands they would never see again, illustrated the human cost of political transformation that foreign intervention had imposed. The foreign colonists who settled in abandoned Spartan territories brought cultural practices and economic techniques that gradually transformed the character of Laconian society beyond recognition. These newcomers, primarily Greeks from northern regions that had long been under Macedonian influence, established communities whose architectural styles, religious observances, and social organisation reflected their origins rather than local traditions. Their bronze-fitted houses displayed design elements that had no connection to traditional Spartan building practices, while their workshops produced goods according to foreign technical standards that gradually displaced local manufacturing traditions. The educational systems that these immigrant communities established for their children emphasized Greek cultural elements that had been suppressed or modified in traditional Spartan society. The schools that operated in former Spartan territories taught rhetoric, philosophy, and artistic techniques that prepared students for participation in broader Hellenistic civilization, rather than the narrow military focus that had characterized traditional Lacedaemonian education. The bronze writing tablets that students used for their lessons contained texts that celebrated foreign achievements and values, while their daily exercises included practices designed to eliminate any lingering attachment to Spartan cultural identity. The military recruitment that Macedonian authorities conducted in Laconia focused on identifying individuals whose physical capabilities and combat experience could be utilized in foreign service rather than local defense. The young Spartans who qualified for such recruitment found themselves assigned to units that operated throughout the Mediterranean, their bronze-fitted equipment marking them as professional soldiers whose loyalty belonged to Hellenistic monarchs rather than their native community. The sight of these men departing for distant campaigns, their bronze-reinforced packs containing personal possessions, while their weapons reflected foreign military standards, demonstrated how thoroughly traditional concepts of citizen-soldier service had been replaced by mercenary employment under foreign command. The archaeological evidence that accumulated during this period reflected the systematic transformation of material culture as foreign influences displaced traditional Spartan practices in every aspect of daily life. The pottery fragments that archaeologists would later discover showed increasing presence of foreign ceramic styles whose decorative motifs and functional designs had no connection to traditional Lacedaemonian pottery traditions. The bronze implements that appeared in domestic contexts reflected manufacturing techniques and design preferences that originated in northern Greece and Macedonia rather than local workshops, while their distribution patterns indicated systematic replacement of traditional tools and household equipment. The linguistic changes that occurred during Macedonian rule included the gradual adoption of Koine Greek as the primary language of administration and commerce, while traditional Laconian dialect features were relegated to informal family contexts, where they gradually disappeared through lack of reinforcement. The bronze-inscribed public documents that marked official announcements displayed linguistic characteristics that reflected foreign scribal traditions, while their legal terminology incorporated concepts that had no equivalents in traditional Spartan legal language. The sight of young Spartans struggling to understand official proclamations written in dialects that their grandparents would have considered foreign illustrated the cultural transformation that political integration had imposed on local society. The religious syncretism that developed under foreign administration combined traditional Spartan deities with Hellenistic religious practices that emphasized universal rather than local spiritual concerns. The bronze cult statues that appeared in traditional shrines displayed artistic styles that reflected foreign sculptural traditions, while their iconographic elements incorporated symbols that had no connection to traditional Lacedaemonian religious imagery. The festivals that continued to operate under the new regime included ritual elements that celebrated Macedonian military achievements alongside traditional observances, creating hybrid religious practices that gradually displaced purely Spartan spiritual traditions. The economic specialization that foreign administration encouraged in Laconian agriculture focused on producing crops and livestock that could be efficiently marketed throughout the Mediterranean, rather than maintaining the subsistence farming that had traditionally supported Spartan society. The bronze-fitted agricultural implements that appeared in rural contexts reflected technological innovations that increased productivity while requiring farming techniques that had no connection to traditional Lacedaemonian agricultural practices. The sight of Helot families learning to operate foreign farming equipment while their traditional agricultural knowledge became increasingly irrelevant illustrated the systematic transformation of rural society that economic integration had imposed. The judicial procedures that Macedonian authorities implemented in Laconia eliminated traditional Spartan legal practices in favour of standardized Hellenistic legal codes that emphasized written law and professional legal expertise rather than customary practices and citizen participation. The bronze-sealed court documents that recorded legal proceedings displayed formatting and language that reflected foreign legal traditions, while their procedural requirements created barriers that prevented ordinary Spartans from effectively participating in legal processes that affected their daily lives. The sight of traditional Spartan legal disputes being resolved according to foreign legal principles by judges whose training had no connection to local legal traditions demonstrated how thoroughly political integration had transformed fundamental aspects of social organization. The transformation of Sparta into a tourist destination for wealthy Romans seeking to observe ancient customs began during the later Hellenistic period as the city's military reputation attracted visitors interested in experiencing remnants of legendary warrior culture. The bronze-fitted accommodations that enterprising locals established for these tourists emphasized exotic aspects of Spartan tradition while carefully avoiding any practices that might suggest political independence or military capability. The sight of foreign visitors watching staged demonstrations of traditional Spartan training methods, their bronze-weighted purses paying for entertainment that bore only superficial resemblance to authentic military education, illustrated the commodification of cultural identity that economic necessity had imposed on the surviving population. The sight of foreign visitors watching staged demonstrations of traditional Spartan training methods, their bronze-weighted purses paying for entertainment that bore only superficial resemblance to authentic military education, illustrated the commodification of cultural identity that economic necessity had imposed on the surviving population. By 27 BC, when Augustus formally established the Roman Empire, Sparta had already completed its transformation from independent military power to provincial curiosity, its ancient institutions reduced to theatrical performances designed to satisfy Roman fascination with Greek antiquity. The municipal status that Augustus granted to Sparta within the newly organised province of Achaea reflected the city's complete political insignificance, rather than any recognition of its historical importance. The Roman administrators who arrived to implement imperial governance found a community of fewer than 8,000 inhabitants scattered across territories that had once supported a population exceeding 200,000 during the classical period. The bronze census tablets that recorded this demographic catastrophe revealed the extent to which centuries of warfare, social upheaval, and foreign occupation had reduced one of Greece's most powerful city-states to a minor provincial settlement, whose primary function involved providing exotic entertainment for wealthy tourists. The Roman colonial architecture that gradually replaced traditional Spartan building styles reflected the systematic integration of Laconia into imperial administrative structures that prioritized efficiency and uniformity over local cultural traditions. The forum that Roman engineers constructed in the centre of ancient Sparta incorporated design elements that could be found in provincial cities throughout the Mediterranean, its limestone columns and marble decorations displaying the standardized imperial style that eliminated distinctive regional characteristics. The bronze-fitted shops that line this new commercial centre sold goods manufactured according to Roman specifications, while their proprietors conducted business using Latin legal terminology that had no connection to traditional Spartan commercial practices. The aqueduct system that Roman engineers constructed to supply the reduced population with reliable water access demonstrated the technological capabilities that imperial administration could provide, yet its construction required the demolition of several ancient Spartan monuments, whose historical significance was deemed less important than practical utility. The bronze pipes that carried water from mountain springs to urban distribution points reflected engineering standards that exceeded anything that traditional Spartan technology had achieved, while their systematic maintenance illustrated the administrative efficiency that characterized Roman provincial governance. The sight of construction crews dismantling ancient stone walls to provide materials for aqueduct foundations, their iron tools chipping away inscriptions that recorded classical military victories, while their supervisors consulted bronze-sealed blueprints that showed no concern for historical preservation, demonstrated how thoroughly practical considerations had displaced cultural sensitivity in imperial development projects. The educational institutions that operated under Roman administration abandoned any pretense of maintaining traditional Spartan training methods in favour of standard rhetorical and philosophical curricula that prepared students for careers in imperial service rather than military leadership. The schools that wealthy Roman families established for their children visiting Sparta emphasized Greek literary classics and philosophical texts, while carefully avoiding any instruction in military tactics or physical conditioning that might suggest preparation for independent political action. The bronze writing tablets that students used for their exercises contained passages from Homer and Plato, rather than traditional Spartan military manuals, while their daily routines emphasized intellectual development and cultural refinement, rather than the physical discipline that had characterized the ancient agoge system. The gladiatorial games that Roman officials occasionally sponsored in Sparta provided controlled outlets for local martial traditions, while ensuring that such activities remained firmly subordinated to imperial entertainment preferences rather than genuine military training. The amphitheatre that was constructed for these events incorporated architectural features that enabled Roman-style spectacles, its stone seating arrangements, and bronze-fitted barriers designed to contain violent entertainment rather than facilitate citizen military education. The sight of former Spartan warriors participating in staged combat for the amusement of Roman audiences, their bronze-reinforced leather armour bearing decorative elements that emphasised theatrical effect over battlefield protection, illustrated the degradation of martial culture that imperial integration had imposed on traditional military society. The religious transformations that occurred during the early imperial period eliminated most distinctive aspects of traditional Spartan spiritual practices, while promoting cults that emphasized loyalty to Roman authority and participation in Mediterranean-wide religious communities. The temples that received imperial funding for renovation were modified to accommodate Roman religious practices, their bronze cult statues replaced with images that reflected imperial artistic preferences, while their ritual procedures were standardized according to practices that could be found throughout the Roman world. The ancient shrine of Artemis Orthia, where generations of Spartan youths had undergone initiation ceremonies that included ritual flogging to demonstrate courage and endurance, was transformed into a tourist attraction where visitors could observe sanitized versions of traditional practices that eliminated any elements suggesting preparation for actual military service. The economic integration that Roman administration achieved in Laconia focused on agricultural production that could efficiently supply urban markets throughout the eastern Mediterranean, rather than maintaining the subsistence farming that had traditionally supported local communities. The olive groves that covered the hills surrounding Sparta were expanded and systematized according to Roman agricultural techniques, their bronze-fitted presses producing oil that was shipped to markets in Athens, Corinth, and eventually Rome itself. The sight of merchant vessels loading amphorae filled with Laconian olive oil at the renovated port facilities of Gythium, their bronze-reinforced hulls bearing cargo that would be consumed in distant cities while local communities received only minimal compensation for their agricultural labour, demonstrated how thoroughly provincial status had subordinated local economic interests to imperial commercial priorities. The social stratification that developed under Roman rule created new hierarchies that bore no resemblance to traditional Spartan class distinctions, while providing opportunities for advancement through imperial service rather than military achievement. The wealthy families that emerged during this period typically derived their status from successful careers in Roman administration or profitable commercial relationships with imperial trading networks, rather than from ancient Spartan aristocratic lineages. Their bronze-fitted villas displayed architectural styles and decorative elements that reflected Roman cultural preferences, while their lifestyle patterns emphasized luxury consumption and social display that violated every principle of traditional Spartan austerity and equality. The tourist industry that developed around Spartan historical reputation created employment opportunities for local residents while systematically distorting traditional cultural practices to satisfy foreign expectations about ancient warrior society. The guides who conducted tours of ancient Spartan sites received training in storytelling techniques that emphasized dramatic narratives over historical accuracy. Their bronze-sealed certification documents, authorizing them to present sanitized versions of Spartan history that eliminated controversial elements such as helot exploitation or the brutal reality of ancient military training. The sight of these professional entertainers leading groups of wealthy Romans through reconstructed training facilities, their theatrical presentations emphasizing exotic customs while carefully avoiding any suggestion that such practices might be relevant to contemporary political or military affairs, illustrated the commodification of cultural heritage that tourism had imposed on historical memory. The archaeological preservation that Roman administrators occasionally sponsored reflected imperial interest in maintaining visible reminders of Greek cultural achievements, while ensuring that such monuments served to glorify Roman cultural superiority rather than inspiring local pride in independent historical traditions. The restoration projects that received imperial funding typically emphasized architectural features that demonstrated Roman engineering capabilities. Their bronze plaques bearing Latin inscriptions that credited Roman generosity for preserving Greek antiquities. The ancient theatre, where Spartan citizens had once gathered to make political decisions, was renovated to accommodate Roman dramatic performances. Its stone seating expanded, and its bronze acoustic equipment modified to support entertainment that celebrated imperial themes rather than local political traditions. The legal system that operated in Roman Sparta eliminated traditional Spartan judicial procedures in favour of standardized imperial legal codes that emphasized written law and professional legal expertise rather than citizen participation in legal decision-making. The courts that handled local disputes operated according to Roman legal principles, their bronze-sealed documents recording proceedings that followed procedural requirements that had no connection to traditional Spartan legal practices. The sight of legal disputes being resolved by Roman-trained judges whose authority derived from imperial appointment rather than local selection, their decisions based on legal precedents established in distant courts rather than customary practices that had governed Spartan society for centuries, demonstrated how thoroughly imperial integration had transformed fundamental aspects of social organization. The military recruitment that Roman authorities conducted in Laconia focused on identifying individuals whose physical capabilities could be utilized in auxiliary units that served throughout the empire, rather than in formations that might maintain connection to local military traditions. The young men who qualified for such service found themselves assigned to cohorts that operated in Britain, Germany, or along the Danube frontier, their bronze-fitted equipment marking them as imperial soldiers whose loyalty belonged to Rome rather than their native community. The recruitment ceremonies that marked their departure from Sparta emphasized their transformation into Roman citizens through military service, their oath-taking procedures conducted in Latin, while their bronze military diplomas granted privileges that were contingent on continued loyalty to imperial authority rather than local community ties. The intellectual life that developed in Roman Sparta reflected the broader cultural trends that characterized provincial Greek cities during the imperial period, with emphasis on antiquarian scholarship and philosophical speculation rather than practical political or military concerns. The libraries that wealthy benefactors established contained collections of classical texts that celebrated ancient achievements while carefully avoiding contemporary works that might suggest alternative political arrangements or independent cultural development. The bronze-sealed scrolls that scholars consulted for their research emphasized historical topics that posed no threat to imperial authority, while their academic discussions focused on literary and philosophical questions that had no connection to contemporary political realities. The festivals that continued to operate under Roman administration combined traditional Greek religious observances with imperial celebrations that emphasized loyalty to Roman authority and participation in empire-wide cultural events. The Canea festival, which had traditionally celebrated Spartan military achievements and social cohesion, was modified to include ceremonies honouring Roman military victories and imperial benefactions to local communities. The bronze ritual implements that were used during these hybrid celebrations reflected artistic styles that combined Greek traditional motifs with Roman imperial symbols, while their ceremonial procedures emphasized themes of gratitude for Roman peace and prosperity, rather than pride in local historical achievements. The demographic decline that continued throughout the imperial period reduced Sparta's population to fewer than 5,000 inhabitants by the 2nd century AD, while the surrounding agricultural territories showed increasing signs of abandonment as economic opportunities drew residents to larger urban centres that offered better prospects for advancement. The census records that Roman administrators compiled revealed age structures that indicated declining birth rates and increasing emigration, particularly among young adults whose education and ambition motivated them to seek careers in cities that offered greater scope for professional development. The bronze census tablets that documented these demographic trends recorded the systematic depopulation of rural areas as traditional agricultural communities dissolved under the pressure of economic change and cultural transformation. The building projects that Roman benefactors sponsored during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD focused on structures that would serve tourist and commercial functions, rather than facilities that might support genuine community development or cultural preservation. The baths that were constructed according to standard Roman designs provided amenities that wealthy visitors expected, their bronze-fitted heating systems and marble decorations reflecting imperial architectural standards, while their operational procedures emphasized luxury services rather than the communal bathing practices that had characterized traditional Spartan culture. The sight of these elaborate facilities being used primarily by foreign tourists, while local residents continued to rely on ancient and inadequate washing facilities, illustrated the extent to which development priorities served external interests rather than community needs. The commercial activities that sustained the local economy during this period depended almost entirely on tourist spending and agricultural exports, rather than the diverse economic base that had supported classical Spartan society. The workshops that produced souvenirs for visitors specialized in bronze replicas of ancient weapons and armor that bore only superficial resemblance to authentic historical artifacts, while their manufacturing processes emphasized rapid production and attractive appearance rather than functional quality or historical accuracy. The sight of craftsmen producing decorative items that satisfied tourist expectations about ancient warrior culture, while lacking any connection to traditional Spartan metalworking techniques, demonstrated how thoroughly commercial considerations had displaced authentic cultural practices. The intellectual traditions that had once characterized Spartan society, including the practical wisdom that had enabled effective military organization and political governance, were gradually forgotten as educational institutions emphasized rhetorical training and philosophical speculation that prepared students for careers in imperial administration rather than community leadership. The last recorded mentions of traditional Spartan governmental procedures appeared in antiquarian texts written during the 2nd century AD, their authors relying on literary sources rather than direct observation of functioning institutions. The bronze-sealed documents that preserved these historical accounts reflected scholarly interest in ancient customs, while acknowledging that such practices had become completely irrelevant to contemporary political realities. The religious practices that survived into the later imperial period retained only superficial connections to traditional Spartan spiritual traditions, while incorporating elements that reflected broader Mediterranean religious developments. The mystery cults that attracted followers in Roman Sparta emphasized personal salvation and universal spiritual themes rather than the civic religious observances that had reinforced community solidarity and cultural identity during the classical period. The bronze votive offerings that worshippers dedicated at ancient shrines displayed artistic styles and iconographic elements that reflected foreign religious influences, while their dedicatory inscriptions were typically written in Latin or Koine Greek rather than traditional Laconian dialect. The Christian communities that began to emerge during the 3rd century AD established religious institutions that explicitly rejected traditional Greek religious practices while promoting spiritual values that emphasized universal brotherhood and rejection of worldly concerns, including military glory and political power. The churches that were constructed in former temple precincts incorporated architectural elements that deliberately contrasted with ancient religious architecture, their simple stone construction and bronze crosses providing visual symbols of religious transformation that explicitly rejected traditional spiritual practices. The sight of Christian congregations gathering in buildings that had once housed ancient Spartan religious observances, their prayers conducted in languages that bore no resemblance to traditional religious formulae, while their spiritual practices emphasized values that contradicted fundamental aspects of ancient warrior culture, demonstrated the complete religious transformation that had accompanied political and cultural change. The educational institutions that operated under Christian influence during the 4th century AD eliminated any remaining connections to traditional Spartan cultural practices, while promoting curriculum that emphasized Christian theological training and classical literary studies that were carefully selected to support religious rather than secular cultural development. The schools that prepared young men for careers in Christian religious institutions taught rhetoric and philosophy according to Christian interpretations, their bronze writing tablets containing theological texts rather than classical military or political works. The sight of students whose ancestors had once trained for military leadership now preparing for religious careers that explicitly rejected martial values and political ambition illustrated the complete transformation of educational priorities that religious change had imposed on traditional cultural institutions. The Visigothic invasion of 396 AD, led by Alaric III during his devastating march through Greece, encountered a Sparta that retained only the geographical location and historical name of the ancient military power that had once dominated the Peloponnese. The city that the Gothic warriors approached contained fewer than 3,000 inhabitants, living in scattered settlements that bore no resemblance to the organised urban community that had characterised classical Sparta. The bronze-fitted weapons that the few remaining defenders possessed reflected Roman military equipment rather than traditional Spartan armament, while their defensive preparations emphasised protection of individual property rather than coordinated community resistance that might have characterised ancient military organisation. The destruction that Alaric's forces inflicted on Sparta during their brief occupation eliminated most of the remaining physical structures that had connected the contemporary settlement to its ancient heritage. The ancient agora, which had served as the political and commercial centre of classical Spartan society, was systematically looted and burned, its stone buildings reduced to rubble, while their bronze fittings were stripped away for military use or commercial sale. The sight of Gothic warriors using ancient Spartan monuments as sources of building materials for their temporary fortifications, their iron tools breaking apart inscriptions that recorded classical military victories, while their campfires consumed wooden architectural elements that had survived for over 6 centuries, marked the final physical destruction of tangible connections to ancient Spartan civilization. The population dispersal that followed the Gothic invasion scattered the remaining inhabitants throughout the eastern Mediterranean, their departure marking the effective end of continuous habitation at the site that had once been the centre of Lacedaemonian power. The few families that attempted to return after the Gothic withdrawal found a landscape of ruins that lacked the economic foundation necessary to support permanent settlement, while the destruction of agricultural infrastructure had eliminated the productivity that might have enabled community reconstruction. The bronze household implements that refugees carried away from the ruins represented the last material connections to a community that had existed continuously for over 8 centuries, their transportation to distant cities marking the final diaspora of people who could claim direct descent from ancient Spartan citizens. The historical legacy that Spartan civilization bequeathed to subsequent political thought proved far more durable than the physical community that had created these influential ideas. The political theorists who studied ancient Spartan institutions during the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods found inspiration in the constitutional arrangements that had balanced royal, aristocratic and democratic elements within a stable governmental framework. The bronze-sealed manuscripts that preserved classical descriptions of Spartan political institutions provided models for political innovation that influenced constitutional development in early modern Europe, while their emphasis on civic virtue and military service inspired political movements that sought to recreate ancient civic excellence within contemporary political contexts. The romanticization of Spartan military culture that emerged during the modern period reflected selective interpretation of ancient sources that emphasized heroic individual achievement while ignoring the brutal social arrangements that had made such military excellence possible. The popular literature that celebrated Spartan warrior values typically focused on dramatic episodes, such as the Battle of Thermopylae, while avoiding detailed examination of the helot system or the harsh training methods that had produced legendary military discipline. The bronze statues that modern governments erected to commemorate Spartan military achievements displayed artistic interpretations that emphasized noble sacrifice and patriotic devotion, rather than the realistic violence and social exploitation that had characterized ancient military culture. The educational theories that drew inspiration from Spartan training methods typically emphasized physical discipline and character development, while carefully avoiding the brutal aspects of ancient education that had included systematic violence and deliberate deprivation. The military academies that claimed to follow Spartan educational principles adapted ancient training concepts to modern humanitarian standards, their bronze-fitted facilities providing rigorous physical conditioning and leadership development without the extreme hardships that had characterized the original agoge system. The sight of contemporary military cadets participating in training exercises that claimed inspiration from ancient Spartan methods, their modern equipment and safety procedures providing protection that ancient trainees had never received, illustrated how thoroughly modern interpretations had transformed historical practices to conform to contemporary moral standards. The political movements that claimed Spartan inspiration during the 19th and 20th centuries typically emphasized aspects of ancient society that supported their particular ideological preferences, while ignoring elements that contradicted their political objectives. The revolutionary governments that cited Spartan precedents for their constitutional arrangements focused on the citizen equality and military service obligations that had characterized classical Lacedaemonian society, while avoiding examination of the slavery and social stratification that had made such arrangements possible. The bronze commemorative medals that these movements issued to honor their historical inspirations displayed artistic motifs that emphasized selected aspects of Spartan culture while omitting visual references to the more problematic elements of ancient social organization. The scholarly research that emerged during the modern period provided increasingly sophisticated understanding of ancient Spartan society. while revealing the complex contradictions that had characterized this influential civilization. The archaeological excavations that began during the 19th century uncovered material evidence that challenged romanticized interpretations of ancient Spartan culture, their bronze artifacts and structural remains providing concrete information about daily life and social organization that supplemented literary sources with physical evidence. The sight of archaeologists carefully excavating ancient Spartan sites, their bronze tools revealing layers of occupation that documented centuries of cultural development and decline, demonstrated how scientific investigation could provide more accurate understanding of historical societies than literary interpretation alone. The comparative studies that modern historians conducted revealed how Spartan political and social institutions had influenced broader patterns of Greek political development, while also demonstrating the unique characteristics that had distinguished Lacedaemonian society from other ancient communities. The bronze-sealed academic publications that documented these research findings provided detailed analysis of constitutional arrangements, military organization, and social structures that enabled more sophisticated appreciation of ancient achievements and limitations. The international scholarly conferences that brought together experts from various academic institutions created opportunities for collaborative research that transcended national boundaries while promoting objective understanding of historical evidence rather than patriotic interpretation of ancient sources. The final assessment of Spartan historical significance reveals a civilization that achieved remarkable military effectiveness and political stability through social arrangements that modern ethical standards would consider unacceptable, yet whose institutional innovations provided valuable insights for subsequent political development. The bronze monuments that commemorate Spartan achievements in museums throughout the world preserve material evidence of a society that demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of human political organization, while their artistic excellence reflects cultural achievements that transcended the narrow military focus that characterized popular understanding of ancient Lacedaemonian civilization. The enduring fascination that Spartan history continues to generate among scholars and popular audiences demonstrates the persistent relevance of questions about civic virtue, military service, and political organization that ancient Spartan society had addressed through institutional arrangements whose influence extended far beyond their original geographical and temporal boundaries. Thus ended the long decline of a civilization that had once commanded the respect and fear of the entire Greek world, its physical destruction in 396 AD marking the conclusion of a process that had begun with the demographic catastrophes of the classical period and continued through centuries of foreign domination and cultural transformation. The archaeological remains that modern excavations have revealed provide a silent testimony to the rise and fall of a unique social experiment whose achievements and failures continue to inform contemporary understanding of the possibilities and limitations inherent in human political organization.